Few dynasties in history have captured the public imagination quite like the Tudors. Their reign, filled with intrigue, ambition, and revolutionary change, reads more like a gripping drama than a historical chapter. From the blood-soaked rise of Henry VII after Civil War to the commanding brilliance of Elizabeth I, the Tudors reshaped England's political, religious, and cultural identity in ways that continue to echo through modern society. Their legacy is not confined to dusty textbooks or royal palaces. It lives on in the way Britain is governed, how its monarchs are portrayed, and even in the global dominance of the English language. To understand the modern world, one must begin in the court of the Tudors. The Tudor dynasty, which reigned in England from 1485 to 1603, represents one of the most transformative and emblematic periods in British history. Emerging from the chaos of the Wars of the Roses, the Tudors established a centralized monarchy that profoundly shaped the political, cultural, and religious trajectory of the nation. Beginning with Henry VII's ascent to the throne following his victory at the Battle of Bosworth Field, and concluding with the death of Elizabeth I, the Tudor era encompasses just over a century of unprecedented change. This was a time of political consolidation, institutional reform, and expansion in both domestic and foreign affairs, laying the groundwork for many aspects of modern governance and society. Henry VII, the dynasty's founder, inherited a fractured realm plagued by dynastic disputes. His immediate focus was to establish political stability and reinforce the legitimacy of his rule. Through strategic marriages, careful management of the nobility, and financial prudence, he set the foundation for a stronger centralized state. His reign introduced a new era of cautious but deliberate governance, exemplified by a focus on bureaucratic structures and fiscal stability that moved England away from feudal instability toward an early modern state apparatus. His son, Henry VIII, dramatically intensified these transformations, particularly through the English Reformation, which forever altered the religious and political landscape. The reign of Henry VIII is perhaps most often associated with his 6 marriages and his break with the Roman Catholic Church, but its importance reaches much further. In asserting royal supremacy over the Church of England, Henry redefined the relationship between church and state, diminishing the influence of foreign ecclesiastical power in English affairs. This move was not solely a personal or spiritual decision. It reflected a calculated assertion of national sovereignty and royal authority. The resulting religious shifts, some violent, some gradual, triggered deep changes in societal structure, individual belief systems, and notions of personal conscience. These developments would resonate far beyond Tudor England, informing later debates over religious liberty and secular governance. Under Edward VI and Mary I, England veered dramatically between Protestant and Catholic identity, each monarch enforcing their religious convictions with state power. These years of oscillation were often fraught and violent, leaving long-lasting scars and deep divisions. However, this period also served to introduce a broader public to the idea that religion and governance were deeply intertwined yet mutable, opening space for future demands for tolerance, pluralism, and reform. The religious turmoil of the mid-Tudor years would eventually give way to a more pragmatic and politically astute settlement under Elizabeth I. Elizabeth's long reign is frequently hailed as a golden age, a term that, while romanticized, captures the consolidation of many Tudor-era advances. She skillfully navigated a male-dominated political world and a web of international threats while maintaining relative internal peace and economic growth. Her ability to sustain authority without marriage or direct heirs challenged prevailing notions about female power, leadership, and monarchy itself. The Elizabethan period saw a flowering of the arts, the strengthening of national identity, and the early seeds of global empire through exploration and maritime expansion. All of these elements contributed to England's emergence as a significant European power. While the Tudors have long captured the public imagination, partly due to their dramatic personal lives, court intrigues, and colorful personalities, their deeper legacy lies in the structural and cultural foundations they laid for the modern world. Many institutions that formed the backbone of British democracy, governance, and civil society can trace their roots to Tudor reforms. From legal codes and bureaucratic organization to education, economic policy, and religious structure, the Tudor state increasingly resembled the kind of centralized and bureaucratic governance familiar to us today. Culturally, the Tudors contributed to a heightened sense of Englishness. Language, literature, fashion, art, and even food evolved under their patronage. The rise of the English Renaissance under Henry VIII and Elizabeth I promoted not only aesthetic refinement but also national self-awareness. Writers such as Shakespeare, Spenser, and Marlowe did not simply entertain, they helped define a distinctly English cultural identity that has endured across centuries. These cultural contributions became vital instruments of soft power, enhancing England's influence beyond its borders in ways that were less immediate than military conquest but equally enduring. The legacy of the Tudors can also be observed in how monarchs and political figures are portrayed and understood today. Tudor propaganda techniques, especially Elizabeth's use of portraits, symbolism and public appearances, anticipated modern media strategies used by political leaders to cultivate personal and national narratives. Similarly, the Tudor court's blend of spectacle and strategy has shaped how modern statecraft engages with the public. The dynamics of power, representation, and communication in the Tudor age offer a lens through which we can analyze contemporary political life. Moreover, the impact of Tudor policies on colonialism and global engagement is profound. While the true imperial expansion would flourish later, it was under Elizabeth I that England first tested its capabilities abroad. Voyages to the Americas, Africa, and Asia during the late Tudor period laid the groundwork for the vast British Empire to come. The consequences of this early imperial activity, ranging from the beginnings of global trade to the long shadow of colonialism, are still playing out today in political, economic, and cultural spheres worldwide. In this video we will trace and examine the long arc of Tudor influence on modern society. Rather than focusing narrowly on biographical or dynastic history, this analysis seeks to draw connections between Tudor innovations and contemporary institutions. Through historical evidence, we will explore how the Tudor transformation of the state and society has been embedded, sometimes obviously, sometimes subtly, into the fabric of modern life. We will analyze key areas including governance, religion, education, gender roles, cultural identity, and foreign policy, always with an eye toward the legacy that continues to inform our world. This is not simply a retrospective exercise. Understanding the Tudors allows us to better understand ourselves. The structures we often take for granted, parliamentary democracy, civil service, religious freedom, national identity, have roots in this complex and dynamic era. The Tudors were not perfect architects. They were often ruthless, contradictory, and driven by immediate political needs. Yet the consequences of their choices shaped the path of England and influenced the global order. Through a cultural and political analysis grounded in historical sources, this work will attempt to unpack the vast and multidimensional impact the Tudors had, and continue to have, on modern society. The rise of the Tudor dynasty marked a critical turning point in English history, particularly in the consolidation of monarchical power. To understand the nature and significance of this transformation, it is essential to begin with the turbulent backdrop from which the Tudors emerged. The Wars of the Roses, a series of dynastic civil wars fought between the rival houses of Lancaster and York, had left England politically unstable and economically strained. This decades-long conflict, spanning from 1455 to 1487, undermined royal authority and devastated the English nobility. By the time Henry Tudor claimed victory at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, the country was desperate for a leader who could restore order and prevent further internal conflict. Henry Tudor, who became Henry VII, ascended to the throne not by hereditary right in the traditional sense but through conquest. His claim to the crown was tenuous at best, derived maternally through Margaret Beaufort, a descendant of the illegitimate Beaufort line of the Lancastrians. Yet it was precisely this weak claim that made his victory so significant. Henry VII understood the fragility of his position and moved quickly and strategically to cement his legitimacy and reinforce the monarchy's supremacy. His first major act was to marry Elizabeth of York, thereby uniting the warring houses and symbolically ending the Wars of the Roses. This marriage was a masterstroke of political reconciliation and branding. It effectively merged the red rose of Lancaster with the white rose of York to form the emblem of the Tudor rose, a new national symbol representing unity and peace. Henry VII's consolidation of power was methodical and far-reaching. He recognized that the monarchy could not rely solely on military might or divine right to secure obedience. Instead, he focused on centralizing authority and dismantling the independent power bases that had allowed the nobility to challenge royal authority so effectively in previous generations. The feudal system, which had long enabled powerful nobles to maintain their own private armies and act as regional rulers in all but name, was gradually weakened under Henry's rule. He curtailed the practice of retaining, whereby nobles kept private armies ostensibly for personal protection. By imposing strict fines and requiring nobles to seek royal licenses for retaining men-at-arms, Henry effectively undercut one of the primary means by which aristocrats had exercised power. In addition to weakening the nobility militarily, Henry VII also moved to limit their political influence. He expanded the role of the royal council and filled it with men chosen more for their loyalty and administrative competence than for their aristocratic pedigree. Lawyers, clerics, and middle-ranking administrators increasingly found themselves in positions of influence within the Tudor government. This shift not only enhanced the efficiency and reach of the state but also changed the composition of political power in England. Governance began to move away from hereditary privilege and toward bureaucratic expertise, a change that would echo through the centuries and find its culmination in modern civil service systems. Financial control was another cornerstone of Henry VII's strategy. He was acutely aware that a financially independent monarch was a politically secure one. Through a variety of means, including feudal dues, bonds and recognizances, fines and trade regulations, Henry dramatically improved the royal treasury. He also revitalized the exchequer and established the chamber system, which allowed him more direct control over financial affairs. These measures not only reduced the king's reliance on parliamentary grants but also signaled the emergence of a more modern fiscal state. The ability of the monarch to maintain a standing household, fund government operations, and support diplomatic initiatives without constant appeals to Parliament gave the crown a stability it had not enjoyed in decades. Beyond finances and internal political restructuring, Henry also sought to secure the monarchy through diplomacy and strategic marriages. His foreign policy was cautious but effective, focusing on creating alliances that would reduce the threat of foreign invasion or dynastic challenge. Treaties with Spain, Scotland, and France helped secure England's borders and enhance its international standing. These diplomatic moves were part of a broader effort to present the Tudor monarchy as a legitimate and stable regime on the European stage. The marriage of his eldest son, Arthur, to Catherine of Aragon was emblematic of this approach. Though Arthur's early death complicated these plans, the intent was clear: to embed the Tudor dynasty within the established networks of European royalty and thereby enhance its claim to legitimacy. The establishment of new political control mechanisms further reinforced this consolidation of monarchical power. Institutions like the Court of Star Chamber were revived and expanded under Henry's rule. Originally intended to ensure that the nobility did not escape justice due to their social status, the Star Chamber became an effective tool for the crown to exert legal pressure on potentially troublesome subjects. It bypassed traditional common law procedures and allowed for swift, often severe judgments. While the court was controversial, it was undeniably effective in curbing aristocratic lawlessness and reinforcing the supremacy of royal justice. Another crucial development during Henry VII's reign was the increasing formalization of royal policy and governance through written records, statutes, and correspondence. The Tudor government became significantly more literate and documentation-focused than its predecessors, which enhanced both its ability to enforce policy and its continuity over time. This bureaucratic transformation contributed to the evolution of a more centralized, rule-bound government, features that are foundational to modern constitutional states. The emphasis on process, record-keeping, and standardized administration laid the groundwork for future legal reforms and helped to institutionalize the power of the crown in ways that would outlast any one monarch. Importantly, Henry VII did not seek to eliminate the role of Parliament, but rather to redefine its relationship with the monarchy. He called Parliament relatively infrequently and typically only when he required funding for specific purposes. While some have criticized this as a sign of autocracy, it was also a reflection of a monarchy that was increasingly able to function independently of aristocratic approval. Over time, this approach created the conditions for a more formal and balanced constitutional arrangement, even if such a system would not fully mature until centuries later. The seeds of constitutional monarchy were planted in this period, not in the sense of a monarch governed by a rigid legal framework, but rather through the gradual delineation of roles, responsibilities, and limits of royal and parliamentary authority. By the time of Henry VII's death in 1509, he had accomplished something few English monarchs before him had achieved: the establishment of a peaceful succession and a relatively stable realm. His legacy was not one of military conquest or religious upheaval; those would come under his son Henry VIII, but rather one of foundational state-building. His careful policies, strategic thinking, and innovative governance mechanisms created a monarchy that was more centralized, financially secure, and institutionally coherent than ever before. He transformed the English crown from a prize contested by warring factions into a durable institution capable of directing the nation's future. This transformation had long-lasting implications not only for the immediate stability of the Tudor dynasty but also for the evolution of the modern British state. The balance of power between crown and nobility shifted decisively in favor of the monarchy, while new mechanisms of governance and accountability began to emerge. The reign of Henry VII set the tone for future monarchs, who would continue to navigate the complex interplay between royal authority, aristocratic ambition, and popular legitimacy. The Tudor project of consolidating the monarchy did not end with Henry VII, but he provided the blueprint for a stronger, more centralized, and ultimately more modern system of governance. The transition from feudal anarchy to institutional monarchy that he oversaw marks one of the most significant and consequential developments in English political history. During the reign of Henry VIII, the English monarchy underwent a series of profound legal and bureaucratic transformations that not only expanded the reach of the crown but also laid important groundwork for the modern British state. These innovations reflected the increasing complexity of governance and the need for more structured, predictable, and centralized forms of authority. The legal and administrative changes implemented under Henry VIII were not merely reactions to political necessity or personal ambition. They signaled a deliberate and often sophisticated effort to modernize the machinery of government and reinforce the power of the crown in everyday life. One of the most significant developments during this period was the evolution of the legal system. Prior to the Tudors, England's legal institutions were patchy, inconsistently applied, and heavily influenced by local customs and noble interference. While there had long been a common law tradition, its reach was often limited by the ability of powerful regional magnates to influence or circumvent justice. Under Henry VIII, the legal system became more uniform, more centralized, and more directly accountable to the monarch. One of the primary mechanisms for this transformation was the use of statutes, laws enacted by Parliament at the behest of the king. Henry VIII's break with the Roman Catholic Church required the legal machinery of the state to support vast changes in religious and administrative authority. Acts of Parliament were used to formalize the king's supremacy over the church, to dissolve monasteries, and to redefine treason in ways that protected royal prerogative. This was a period in which law became an increasingly powerful tool of governance, rather than merely a forum for dispute resolution. The use of statute law to enforce religious and political conformity marked a significant shift in how the monarchy exercised control over society. The principle that the law could be used to shape public belief, discipline dissent, and consolidate authority would remain central to governance well beyond the Tudor period. The Star Chamber played a crucial role in this evolving legal framework. Though it existed before Henry VIII, it was under his rule that the court reached the height of its influence. It was intended to ensure that even the most powerful subjects were not above the law. Functioning outside of the traditional common law courts, the Star Chamber focused on cases of corruption, public disorder, and abuses of power that could not be fairly adjudicated in local jurisdictions. It was particularly effective in cases involving nobles who might intimidate juries or manipulate local officials. The court emphasized equity over strict legal precedent, aiming for fair outcomes in situations where formal law might fall short or be inapplicable. Critics of the Star Chamber have noted its lack of due process and the potential for political manipulation, and there is some truth to these concerns. However, from the perspective of state formation, its significance cannot be overstated. It helped break the power of the old feudal nobility, ensured a more consistent application of justice, and reinforced the notion that all subjects were accountable to the crown. Its methods and decisions, while often harsh, paved the way for later discussions about judicial impartiality and the rule of law. The idea that the central state could intervene in local disputes and override traditional privilege was a key step toward modern legal and governmental structures. Parallel to these judicial reforms was the rapid expansion of the government bureaucracy. As the responsibilities of the state increased, particularly after the break with Rome and the absorption of ecclesiastical revenues and properties, the administrative apparatus of the monarchy had to grow accordingly. The Court of Augmentations was created to handle the wealth and land seized from the monasteries, while other specialized courts and offices dealt with taxation, war funding, royal households, and diplomatic correspondence. These offices required a growing cadre of literate, trained officials who could implement royal policy efficiently and consistently across the realm. This shift toward specialization marked the beginning of a proto-civil service. The traditional reliance on nobles or clerics to manage administrative tasks was increasingly supplemented, and sometimes replaced, by lay professionals. Men like Thomas Cromwell, a commoner who rose to become one of the most powerful figures in Henry VIII's court, exemplified this trend. Cromwell was instrumental in organizing and expanding government departments, advocating for merit-based appointments, and insisting on thorough record-keeping and accountability. His emphasis on administrative competence over noble birth helped redefine what it meant to serve the state. These changes set important precedents for the future development of a professional civil service, one based not on lineage or personal loyalty, but on skill, efficiency, and adherence to institutional procedures. Record-keeping and documentation became central to Tudor administration. Policies were codified, laws were archived, and correspondence was systematically managed. This attention to written records allowed for a level of continuity and oversight that had previously been absent. It also made the government more transparent and accountable, at least within its own internal mechanisms. Future monarchs and ministers could refer to previous decisions, compare outcomes, and make informed policy adjustments. The accumulation of bureaucratic knowledge and procedural memory strengthened the institutional capacity of the state. Another important feature of the Tudor bureaucratic model was its territorial ambition. The government extended its reach not only into urban centers and ports but also into rural areas and previously semi-autonomous regions. Royal agents, justices of the peace, tax collectors, and ecclesiastical commissioners operated under centralized authority and reported back to London. This created a more integrated national framework, where local governance was no longer entirely in the hands of the gentry or the church but was subject to oversight and direction from the crown. This integration helped to create a sense of national unity and standardized administration, which in turn laid the foundations for the modern nation-state. The long-term impacts of these legal and bureaucratic changes are substantial. Many of the institutions and practices established or expanded during Henry VIII's reign became permanent fixtures of English governance. The idea that the state should maintain a standing bureaucracy staffed by professionals, the use of law as a tool of statecraft, the collection and management of public records, and the belief in a single central legal authority, these principles became hallmarks of later British administration. While the Tudor approach to governance was often autocratic and lacked many modern safeguards against abuse, its institutional innovations were essential to the development of a more capable and durable state. Furthermore, the Tudor legal and bureaucratic system created expectations among the populace. People began to see the state not just as a distant, symbolic authority, but as an entity capable of intervention, regulation, and enforcement in their daily lives. Whether it was through taxation, property disputes, or religious conformity, the government increasingly touched every aspect of society. This visibility helped normalize the presence of state institutions and prepared the ground for later developments in public administration, representative government, and legal reform. In retrospect, the reign of Henry VIII appears not just as a moment of dynastic drama and religious upheaval but as a critical juncture in the formation of modern governance. His legal and bureaucratic innovations, driven by a mix of necessity, ambition, and ideological change, helped to reshape the English state into a more centralized, capable, and enduring institution. These changes were not fully democratic, nor were they free from coercion or error, but they contributed essential components to the machinery of modern government, components that still influence British political life today. The English Reformation stands as one of the most transformative episodes in the history of the British Isles, a revolution that fundamentally altered the country's religious structure, its political institutions, and its cultural identity. Unlike the parallel movements in continental Europe driven largely by theological concerns and doctrinal disputes, the English Reformation was rooted initially in political motivations. Yet the consequences extended far beyond the political sphere, ushering in a gradual but decisive shift from a theocratic society to one in which secular governance, religious pluralism, and personal conscience would slowly come to be respected. The break from the Catholic Church initiated under the reign of Henry VIII was not, at least in its early stages, a movement of religious reform in the doctrinal sense. Henry had shown himself to be a staunch opponent of Lutheranism, even earning the title Defender of the Faith from Pope Leo X for his rebuttal of Martin Luther's teachings. The catalyst for the schism was instead deeply personal and political: Henry's determination to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, who had failed to produce a male heir. The Pope's refusal to grant this annulment, due to a complex web of ecclesiastical precedent and international politics, especially pressure from Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, forced Henry to consider an alternative path. That path was the severing of ties with the papacy and the creation of an independent English church under royal supremacy. Through a series of legislative acts passed by Parliament between 1531 to 1535, including the Act in Restraint of Appeals and the Act of Supremacy, Henry established himself as the supreme head of the Church of England. These measures effectively removed the authority of the Pope in English spiritual and temporal affairs, consolidating unprecedented religious and political power in the hands of the monarch. While the doctrinal teachings of the new church remained largely aligned with Catholic orthodoxy during Henry's lifetime, the institutional framework had been fundamentally transformed. The English Reformation in its inception was therefore a political revolution masquerading as a spiritual one. Despite its politically motivated origin, the Reformation in England quickly took on theological dimensions, particularly under the reigns of Henry's successors. Edward VI, influenced by Protestant advisors, steered the Church of England toward more overtly reformed doctrines and practices. The introduction of the Book of Common Prayer and the abolition of the Mass signaled a deeper break with Roman Catholic tradition. Although the brief return to Catholicism under Mary I temporarily reversed these changes, the accession of Elizabeth I marked the beginning of a more stable and enduring Protestant settlement. Her religious policy, often referred to as the Elizabethan religious settlement, attempted to find a middle path between the extremes of Catholicism and radical Protestantism. The goal was not theological purity but national unity, ensuring that religion would serve the stability of the state rather than become its undoing. This fusion of religious reform and political consolidation had significant implications for English society. By placing the monarch at the head of the national church, the Reformation reinforced the idea that religious authority could be subordinated to the needs of the state. This shift began to erode the deeply entrenched theocratic mindset that had characterized medieval Christendom. In the Catholic worldview, ultimate authority resided with the Church, which stood above kings and emperors in spiritual matters. The English Reformation inverted this hierarchy, asserting that the state, embodied by the crown, could dictate religious policy and organization. While this did not immediately usher in secularism in the modern sense, it planted the seeds of a more secular political order by demonstrating that religious authority could be nationalized, politicized, and even contested. One of the most enduring legacies of the English Reformation was the gradual, uneven movement toward religious pluralism. While the short-term effects were often repressive, the persecution of Catholics under Elizabeth I and later the marginalization of nonconformist Protestants, the long-term trajectory pointed toward greater religious tolerance. The very act of breaking from Rome had created a precedent for dissent. If the authority of the Pope could be rejected by the state, then it followed that individuals might also begin to question the authority of the state church. This logic underpinned the emergence of dissenting sects such as the Puritans, Baptists, Quakers, and others who would challenge the monopoly of the Church of England. Though these groups were often suppressed in the 16th and 17th centuries, their existence pointed to a transformation in the cultural landscape. The English people were no longer spiritually monolithic. The fractures introduced by the Reformation widened over time, eventually leading to a recognition, sometimes grudging, often pragmatic, that coexistence might be preferable to perpetual conflict. The Toleration Act of 1689, which granted limited freedoms to non-Anglican Protestants, and later the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829, were milestones in this journey. Each was rooted in the precedent that religious belief could exist independently of both Rome and Westminster. The weakening of ecclesiastical dominance also had profound implications for secular governance. Before the Reformation, the Church was one of the largest landowners and wielded enormous legal and political power. Its courts, laws, and officials operated alongside and sometimes in competition with those of the Crown. The dissolution of the monasteries between 1536 to 1541 under Henry VIII was not only a religious act but also a massive transfer of wealth and power from the Church to the Crown and its supporters. The redistribution of monastic lands created a new class of landowners with vested interests in the new religious and political order. This act of economic reengineering contributed to the rise of a more diversified elite, one whose power was increasingly tied to loyalty to the state rather than to Rome. The decline of ecclesiastical power also influenced the development of English legal and political institutions. With the church courts diminished, secular courts began to assert greater jurisdiction over areas previously governed by canon law, such as marriage, inheritance, and moral conduct. Over time, this expanded the purview of civil law and increased the authority of common law institutions. The replacement of spiritual authority with legal rational authority is a hallmark of modern statehood. The English Reformation thus contributed to the emergence of a political culture in which legitimacy derived not from divine sanction alone but from legal process, political consent, and institutional stability. Moreover, the shift in religious authority had deep psychological and philosophical effects. By challenging the notion of an infallible ecclesiastical hierarchy, the Reformation opened intellectual space for individual conscience, critical inquiry, and eventually, secular humanism. These ideas would not flourish immediately or uniformly, but they gained traction in the centuries that followed. The Protestant emphasis on direct access to Scripture, without the mediation of clergy, encouraged literacy, debate, and personal interpretation. These practices nurtured a more literate and engaged public, capable of participating in religious and political discourse. They also laid the intellectual groundwork for Enlightenment thought, which would further challenge both religious orthodoxy and political absolutism. It would be a mistake to romanticize the English Reformation as a triumph of freedom or reason. It was, in many respects, coercive, violent, and exclusionary. Yet its long-term consequences cannot be overlooked. It began a process by which religion, once the cornerstone of political legitimacy and social order, became one among many sources of identity and authority. Over time, this transformation enabled the emergence of pluralistic societies where religious belief was increasingly seen as a private matter rather than a public mandate. The separation, however imperfect, between church and state began here, with a monarch who turned a personal marital crisis into a national constitutional revolution. The English Reformation also set England apart from its European neighbors in ways that would shape its global role. As the Protestant Reformation deepened, England came to see itself as a bulwark against Catholic tyranny and as a defender of a purer, national Christianity. This sense of exceptionalism fed into broader imperial ambitions and cultural narratives that would influence English and later British identity for centuries. Whether in the colonization of the Americas, the suppression of Catholic uprisings in Ireland, or the establishment of Anglican missions abroad, the legacy of the English Reformation extended well beyond the church walls. The English Reformation was a turning point not just in religious history, but in the evolution of governance, national identity, and civil society. Initiated by political necessity, it evolved into a profound restructuring of authority and belief. It redefined the relationship between the individual and the state, between church and law, and between faith and reason. Its influence can be traced in the rise of constitutional government, the growth of individual rights, and the gradual but enduring movement toward religious and intellectual freedom. While its immediate legacy was one of conflict and control, its deeper impact was to open new possibilities for how societies organize power, belief, and the pursuit of truth. In Tudor England, the intertwining of power, learning, and reform reshaped the nation's intellectual landscape and laid the groundwork for what would become the foundations of modern liberal education. The period witnessed a surge in interest in humanist thought, educational expansion, and intellectual inquiry, largely driven by the policies and patronage of monarchs such as Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. These developments were not isolated scholarly trends. They were intimately tied to the broader transformations occurring in governance, religion, and society. Education under the Tudors evolved from an elite privilege into an increasingly important tool for public service, personal advancement, and national identity. The early 16th century saw a revival of classical learning and educational values, heavily influenced by Renaissance humanism. Humanism, with its emphasis on the study of ancient texts, moral philosophy, and the development of eloquence and reasoning, became a key intellectual force in Tudor England. It was rooted in the belief that a good education in the humanities could form virtuous, capable citizens and leaders. This view resonated deeply with the Tudor monarchs, who saw in it both a means to consolidate their authority and to prepare a class of educated officials capable of managing the increasingly complex machinery of the state. Henry VIII, despite his turbulent reign and authoritarian tendencies, was a notable patron of learning. His court included some of the most brilliant scholars and humanists of the age, including Thomas More, Thomas Linacre, and Desiderius Erasmus. Henry's own education had been thoroughly humanist. He was well versed in Latin, theology, music, and philosophy. This background influenced his support for educational institutions and the promotion of scholarly values within his government. More importantly, his break from the Roman Catholic Church created a need for an educated class of clergy and civil servants loyal to the crown, not Rome. This practical need drove the expansion and reform of schools and universities, especially as the Church's traditional educational institutions were being dismantled or repurposed during the Reformation. The dissolution of the monasteries, while devastating to some centers of learning, created opportunities for the redistribution of educational resources. Henry and his advisors re-endowed many former monastic schools and established new foundations, including cathedral grammar schools intended to serve both the children of the gentry and the rising urban middle class. These schools emphasized Latin, rhetoric, and classical literature, subjects central to humanist thought. This emphasis marked a shift away from the purely theological curriculum of medieval scholasticism toward a broader intellectual training that included history, ethics, and civic engagement. Elizabeth I continued and expanded this commitment to education. Like her father, she was a product of humanist ideals, multilingual, deeply literate, and politically astute. Her reign saw the growth of grammar schools throughout England, often funded by wealthy merchants, noble families, or civic organizations. The establishment of such schools signaled a democratization of learning, at least among the male population. While education remained largely inaccessible to the lower classes and to women, the increased availability of structured schooling for boys laid a foundation for the gradual expansion of educational opportunity in the centuries to follow. These grammar schools were rigorous institutions. Their curriculum was dominated by Latin grammar and composition, but also included elements of Greek, logic, and moral philosophy. Students were trained to read, write, argue, and think critically, skills that would prepare them for university or for service in the church, government, or law. These subjects and skills, rooted in classical antiquity and championed by humanist educators, became cornerstones of liberal education. The emphasis was not only on accumulating knowledge, but on shaping the character and intellect of the student. The idea was that education should produce not merely specialists, but well-rounded individuals capable of contributing meaningfully to society. At the university level, humanist influence brought about major reforms. Oxford and Cambridge, the two premier institutions of higher learning in England, saw a transformation in curriculum and institutional culture. Although still steeped in religious instruction, their programs began to incorporate classical texts, secular philosophy, and new approaches to pedagogy. Colleges that had once been ecclesiastical training grounds started to produce civil servants, diplomats, and intellectuals. Lectures in Aristotle and Cicero replaced older scholastic commentaries, and students were encouraged to engage in disputation and rhetorical exercises. These changes reflected a broader shift in the purpose of education, from the preservation of doctrine to the cultivation of intellectual agency. The role of Erasmus of Rotterdam, though he spent relatively little time in England, cannot be overstated in this context. His works, especially The Education of a Christian Prince and The Praise of Folly, were widely read and admired among English humanists. Erasmus championed the study of classical languages, critical scholarship, and moral philosophy, and his call for internal reform within the Church appealed to English reformers. His correspondence with English figures such as Thomas More and John Colet helped disseminate humanist ideas across the academic and political elite. Erasmus's emphasis on reason, moderation, and moral clarity influenced both educational theory and broader cultural attitudes in Tudor England. Thomas More, too, was a seminal figure in the English humanist tradition. His book Utopia, while fictional, reflected the tensions and aspirations of the time, the desire for a more just society, the critique of existing institutions, and the value of education in shaping ethical citizens. More believed that knowledge should serve both individual virtue and the common good. His life and writings exemplified the intersection of intellectual rigor, political responsibility, and ethical commitment that defined the highest ideals of humanist education. Though his eventual execution revealed the limitations of intellectual freedom under Henry VIII, his legacy endured in the values he promoted. Another critical development was the translation and dissemination of classical and religious texts into English. The Tudor period witnessed a growing movement to make education and knowledge accessible beyond the Latin literate elite. Translations of the Bible, philosophical works, and historical accounts contributed to a broader intellectual awakening. Literacy rates began to rise, especially among the merchant and professional classes, as the printed word became more available and more central to public life. The proliferation of books and pamphlets helped spread humanist ideals and created a more informed and reflective citizenry. The long-term effects of Tudor educational reform are evident in the modern conception of liberal education. The focus on the humanities, the belief in education as a means of moral and civic development, and the insistence on intellectual autonomy all trace their roots to this period. While access remained limited by class and gender, the principle that education could serve not only the elite but the nation as a whole began to take root. The grammar school student of the Tudor era, trained in Latin and rhetoric, was the forerunner of the modern student of the humanities, taught to reason, to question, and to contribute to public discourse. Moreover, the Tudor emphasis on education helped shape the broader culture of governance and public service. As the state expanded its bureaucratic functions, it needed literate, trained individuals to carry out its policies and manage its institutions. Schools and universities became pipelines not only to religious office but to political and administrative roles. Education was no longer a private good but a public necessity, tied directly to the stability and efficiency of the realm. This connection between education and civic responsibility is a defining characteristic of liberal democracy, and its origins in Tudor policy and humanist thought remain instructive. The Tudor period marked a significant turning point in the history of education in England. Through the patronage of monarchs, the influence of humanist thinkers, and the institutional reforms of schools and universities, the era forged a new vision of learning that emphasized critical thinking, moral development, and public service. These changes laid the intellectual and institutional foundations for modern liberal education, fostering a tradition of inquiry and civic engagement that continues to shape educational ideals to this day. In Tudor England, the ascent of Mary I and Elizabeth I to the throne marked a dramatic and complex redefinition of gender roles and political leadership. At a time when monarchy was overwhelmingly associated with male rule and when women were largely excluded from positions of public authority, the reigns of these two queens stood as remarkable deviations from the norm. They did not merely inherit the crown. They shaped the role of queenship in distinct and influential ways that challenged prevailing assumptions about gender and governance. Their lives and reigns continue to influence modern ideas about female power, authority, and the political use of identity. Mary I, the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, became the first queen regnant in English history, meaning she ruled in her own right rather than as a consort. Her path to the throne was far from assured. For most of her life, Mary was treated as a dynastic pawn and later as a political liability, especially after her father's controversial marriage annulment and the establishment of the Church of England. During the reign of her half-brother Edward VI, she was sidelined due to her Catholic faith and faced pressure to renounce her beliefs. However, after Edward's death and the brief rule of Lady Jane Grey, Mary successfully asserted her claim to the throne, rallying popular support and overcoming political resistance. Mary's reign was defined by her determination to restore Roman Catholicism in England. Her efforts were sincere and driven by conviction, but they were also deeply unpopular in many quarters, particularly among the Protestant elite. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain, while politically motivated to secure a Catholic alliance, exacerbated fears of foreign domination and stoked national resentment. The violent suppression of Protestant dissent, including the execution of hundreds of heretics, earned her the moniker Bloody Mary in Protestant historiography. This legacy, while exaggerated in some respects, has overshadowed her historical significance as a female ruler navigating a male-dominated political environment. Despite the controversies of her reign, Mary I established critical precedents. She demonstrated that a woman could command loyalty, raise armies, issue decrees, and hold sovereign authority. Her coronation, modeled closely on those of her male predecessors, was a carefully orchestrated assertion of legitimacy. She wore the crown, wielded the scepter, and invoked the language of divine right just as a king would. Though she faced resistance and constant scrutiny, her rule challenged the deeply entrenched belief that women were unfit to govern. The sheer fact of her reign, its political struggles notwithstanding, forced England's political and religious institutions to reckon with the reality of female sovereignty. If Mary's rule was a test of the concept of a reigning queen, Elizabeth I's reign was a full-scale reimagining of it. Elizabeth, the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, inherited a kingdom fraught with religious division, economic difficulty, and political instability. Yet through astute diplomacy, charismatic leadership, and careful self-presentation, she transformed the monarchy and reshaped the nation. Her 45-year reign is often celebrated as a golden age in English history, marked by cultural flourishing, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, and the consolidation of national identity. Elizabeth's success as a female monarch depended in part on her ability to navigate the expectations of a patriarchal society. From the outset of her reign, there was enormous pressure on her to marry and produce an heir. Parliament and foreign courts alike viewed marriage as both a personal duty and a political necessity. But Elizabeth resisted this pressure, crafting a public identity that allowed her to exercise full sovereign power while deflecting criticism for her unmarried status. The creation of the Virgin Queen persona was one of the most brilliant political strategies of her time. This cultivated image drew on religious symbolism, classical mythology, and nationalistic fervor. Elizabeth presented herself as married to her kingdom, claiming that her subjects were her children and that her primary loyalty was to England itself. Portraits and speeches reinforced her chastity, strength, and divine appointment, casting her in roles that blended traditional femininity with regal authority. By turning her unmarried status into a virtue, she neutralized one of the chief criticisms leveled against female rulers, that they were incomplete or unstable without a male consort. In doing so, she subverted the very gender norms that might have constrained her. Elizabeth's reign also saw the expansion of female influence beyond the throne. Her court included several powerful women, noble ladies, ladies-in-waiting, and female advisors, who gained visibility and informal influence. While they did not hold formal political office, they navigated court politics, mediated relationships, and sometimes wielded significant soft power. This created new, albeit limited, opportunities for women within the political sphere, hinting at the potential for broader societal change. Both Mary and Elizabeth thus played pivotal roles in redefining leadership and power for women. Their reigns did not end patriarchy, nor did they radically alter the roles of most women in society. However, they proved that women could lead effectively, inspire loyalty, make critical decisions, and embody the state. This had lasting symbolic impact. In the centuries that followed, debates about women's capacity for leadership would frequently reference these two queens. Whether cited as cautionary tales or role models, they remained fixtures in political discourse and cultural memory. Moreover, their reigns influenced the evolution of the English monarchy itself. The institution became more adaptable, more responsive to public image and perception. The importance of symbolism, language, and performance, so central to both Mary's and Elizabeth's rule, set the stage for modern politics, where gender, persona, and communication are essential tools of power. Elizabeth in particular mastered the art of public relations, giving set-piece speeches, commissioning portraits, and crafting a mythos around her person that outlived her reign. In this sense, she anticipated modern forms of political charisma and brand-like identity, strategies used by contemporary leaders regardless of gender. The legacy of these Tudor queens also helped shape feminist thought in later eras. As women began to agitate for education, suffrage, and equal rights, they often invoked historical examples of powerful women to counter the argument that leadership was inherently male. Elizabeth I in particular became a cultural icon, portrayed in literature, drama, and popular history as a symbol of female strength and autonomy. Her ability to maintain authority without a husband, to command respect in a male-dominated world, and to leave a lasting impact on her country offered a compelling narrative for those seeking to redefine women's roles in public life. However, their legacies are not without complexity. Both Mary and Elizabeth operated within, and at times reinforced, the patriarchal structures of their time. Neither actively promoted the advancement of women as a class. Elizabeth, in particular, avoided the company of outspoken female intellectuals and was often wary of associating her rule with any broader feminist cause. Their success came not from rejecting gender norms entirely, but from manipulating them strategically, turning perceived weaknesses into sources of strength. This ambivalence reflects a broader tension still present in modern discussions of women in power, the balance between individual achievement and structural transformation. In many ways, the lives of Mary and Elizabeth anticipated the challenges faced by modern women in leadership. The scrutiny of their personal lives, the pressure to conform to conflicting gender expectations, and the use of image and language to assert authority are all issues that continue to confront female politicians today. Their reigns offer a historical lens through which to examine the enduring dynamics of gender and power, illuminating both the progress that has been made and the barriers that persist. Ultimately, the significance of the Tudor queens lies not only in their achievements, but in the way they reshaped the political imagination. By ruling successfully in an era that believed women were unfit to do so, they forced society to reconsider its assumptions. Their reigns were not merely anomalies, but turning points in the long and ongoing story of women and power. The echoes of their rule are still felt today, in the rhetoric of female politicians, in the representation of women in media, and in the evolving expectations of leadership in the modern world. The reign of Elizabeth I marked a transformative era in which the sense of English national identity was consciously and strategically cultivated. In a time of political uncertainty, religious fragmentation, and external threats, the Tudor state recognized the importance of unifying its people under a shared sense of purpose and cultural belonging. This was not a passive evolution but an active construction, rooted in the arts, state religion, and the deliberate use of propaganda. The result was a distinctive national consciousness that has left a lasting imprint on the modern concept of nationalism and the mechanics of state building. The mid to late 16th century was a critical moment for England. The country had experienced intense internal conflict following the Protestant Reformation, including uprisings, executions, and dramatic shifts in state religion under the reigns of Henry VIII, Edward VI, and Mary I. When Elizabeth came to power in 1558, she inherited a nation still reeling from division and instability. Her government sought to stabilize the realm, not only through pragmatic governance and military defense but also through the creation of a powerful and unifying national story, one that would fuse loyalty to the crown with a broader sense of English identity. Elizabeth's reign coincided with the rise of the printing press, increased literacy and expanding cultural production. These developments made it possible for state-sponsored ideas to reach a much wider audience than ever before. The government understood the power of language, imagery, and spectacle, and used them to foster a sense of unity and pride. Elizabeth herself became a central symbol in this effort. Through carefully staged public appearances, portraits, speeches, and festivals, she was presented not only as a monarch but as the embodiment of the English nation, wise, virtuous, and divinely chosen. The cultivation of Elizabeth's image as the Virgin Queen served more than dynastic or personal purposes. It played a central role in constructing a national mythos. She was portrayed as a protector of her people, a bringer of peace and prosperity, and a bulwark against foreign and religious threats. This image helped unify subjects across religious and regional lines by elevating loyalty to the Queen as a patriotic act. The absence of a king allowed Elizabeth to step into a unique symbolic space, where her gender, rather than being a weakness, was transformed into a sign of divine exceptionality and national uniqueness. Religion also played a key role in shaping national identity under Elizabeth. After decades of turmoil, her government established a religious settlement that positioned the Church of England as both a spiritual and political institution. While not as doctrinally rigid as some Protestant movements, the Elizabethan Church was distinctly English in its independence from Rome and its close alignment with the Crown. Attending Anglican services became a legal obligation, but it also became a ritual of national belonging. Through prayer, hymn, and sermon, religious practice was turned into a mechanism for reinforcing loyalty to the state. The very idea of being English became increasingly tied to Protestant identity, a contrast sharpened by the external threat posed by Catholic powers such as Spain. The Spanish Armada in 1588 became a defining moment in this narrative of Englishness. The successful defense against invasion was not only a military triumph but a symbolic validation of England's divine favor, resilience, and moral superiority. The victory was swiftly woven into the national myth, celebrated in ballads, paintings, and sermons. It created a narrative of English exceptionalism that emphasized independence, courage, and divine protection. This event galvanized a sense of collective pride and identity that transcended traditional divisions and aligned the population more closely with the goals of the state. The arts played a pivotal role in constructing and disseminating this sense of national identity. The Elizabethan period is often remembered for its cultural achievements, particularly in literature and drama. Writers such as William Shakespeare, Edmund Spenser, and Christopher Marlowe contributed to a flourishing of English letters that was deeply intertwined with the national project. Their works often explored themes of kingship, patriotism, and the moral duties of rulers and citizens. Shakespeare's history plays, for instance, presented dramatized versions of England's past that reinforced ideas of continuity, legitimacy, and national unity. These cultural productions helped ordinary people understand their place in the broader story of the nation, turning history and myth into shared cultural memory. Language itself became an important marker of identity during this time. The elevation of English as a language of state, religion, and literature reinforced the sense of a distinct national culture. Under previous monarchs, Latin had been the language of law, diplomacy, and worship. Elizabeth's government encouraged the use of English in all of these domains, thus making the national language a symbol of autonomy and cultural pride. The translation of the Bible into English, especially the enduring impact of the 1560 Geneva Bible, brought scriptural authority into the vernacular and allowed people to participate more directly in the religious and moral life of the nation. Propaganda and public spectacle were tools deliberately used to construct and reinforce the image of a united, virtuous, and invincible England. Royal progresses, Elizabeth's annual tours through different parts of the country, were orchestrated political performances in which the Queen encountered her subjects and reminded them of their mutual bond. These events were accompanied by pageantry, local celebrations, and elaborate displays that both flattered the monarch and celebrated local contributions to the kingdom. Through such engagements, the monarchy projected an image of closeness to the people, even as the state's reach and authority expanded. The lasting legacy of this constructed national identity is significant. Elizabethan nationalism was one of the earliest examples in Europe of a monarchic state consciously forging a cultural and political identity around shared symbols, language, and religious practice. It was not nationalism in the modern sense, with mass political movements or democratic institutions, but it laid important foundations for later developments. The Tudor state's ability to bind its people through a blend of cultural myth, centralized governance, and symbolic leadership demonstrated how power could be consolidated not merely through force but through shared belief and cultural cohesion. In the centuries that followed, the model established during the Elizabethan period would influence how states approached nation-building. The idea that a nation needed a shared history, a common language, and a central figurehead or myth became a recurring theme in political thought and practice. The Elizabethan example showed that identity could be forged as much through stories, symbols, and shared rituals as through laws and armies. This has had a profound impact on the development of modern nationalism, where leaders, movements, and governments often seek legitimacy by appealing to a constructed national past and invoking unifying symbols. Moreover, the Elizabethan model demonstrated the power of art and literature in shaping public consciousness. The connection between cultural production and political identity remains strong in the modern world, where film, media, literature, and education continue to play central roles in forming national narratives. The use of heroic figures, foundational myths, and cultural achievements to promote unity and pride is still common in contemporary politics, both democratic and authoritarian. The creation of national identity during the Elizabethan era was a calculated and multifaceted endeavor that harnessed religion, art, propaganda, and personal symbolism to bind a diverse and divided population into a more cohesive whole. It helped stabilize the Tudor regime, fostered a sense of pride and purpose, and laid the groundwork for future understandings of what it means to belong to a nation. The echoes of this identity project can still be seen in how modern states define themselves, tell their histories, and rally their citizens around a shared idea of who they are. England's engagement with global exploration began with a sense of geopolitical curiosity and nascent economic ambition during the late 15th century. Under Henry VII, expeditions were envisioned not just as extraordinary voyages but as pragmatic tools for trade and sovereignty. The royal charter given to John Cabot in 1496, sanctioning voyages from Bristol, exemplified this. Tasked with finding a northwest route to Asia, Cabot instead landed in what is now Newfoundland in 1497. Though he misidentified it as Asia, the voyage nonetheless opened a North Atlantic foothold for England, primarily symbolic at the time but foundational. The Crown decreed that all commerce from his discovery must funnel through Bristol, with a luxury of profits taxed only 1/5 by the king, ensuring future wealth remained under royal oversight. These early colonial rights set important precedents for state-controlled expansion. Over the following decades, exploration intertwined with economic and military ventures. The sea became a theater not only for discovery but for naval rivalry and privateering. Sailors such as Francis Drake and John Hawkins challenged the dominance of Spain and Portugal, echoes of rivalry that would later define imperial competition. Drake, in particular, rose from humble origins in Devon to become a knighted vice-admiral of the English fleet. His remarkable circumvention saw him claim land for Queen Elizabeth I, baptized New Albion, and raid Spanish shipping for plunder and prestige. His exploits blended adventurism with state sanction. He wasn't just a marauder but a symbol of English maritime strength. His crowning moment came during the 1588 defeats of the Spanish Armada, in which Drake played a central role. This victory resonated far beyond the battlefield, reinforcing a narrative of divine favor and national resilience. England's apparent ability to ward off an overwhelming Spanish fleet imbued the populace and court with a potent belief in its naval destiny. Drake's triumph helped propel England from a hesitant maritime player to a self-assertive sea power. Parallel to Drake's adventurous spirit, Walter Raleigh embodied the transition of England's overseas ambitions from raids and reconnaissance to settlement and empire building. Granted a royal patent in 1584, Raleigh founded the Virginia expeditions, naming the fledgling territory after his sovereign, the Virgin Queen. Although the Roanoke colony vanished mysteriously, it initiated English presence in North America. His Guiana expedition, though unsuccessful in discovering El Dorado, fed English appetites for wealth and expansion. These ventures illustrated a shift from temporary naval dominance to the establishment of physical imperial claims, territoriality over fleeting plunder. These voyages occurred amid a broader push toward maritime exploration, often funded by joint stock companies and private investors rather than the crown itself. England's excommunication by the Pope after Henry VIII's break from Rome drove it to seek new economic paths. Trading networks expanded through groups like the Muscovy Company to Russia, and commercial ventures circumvented Catholic commercial monopolies. London rapidly became England's commercial hub, dealing in spices, timber and precious metals brought back by sea captains, already setting the framework for an imperial economy rooted in maritime exchange. Printing presses and public enthusiasm helped bolster the public narrative of a nation on the move. The union of exploration and culture extended into propaganda and identity formation. The monarchy, particularly Elizabeth I, skillfully promoted voyages as national projects, intertwining commerce, faith, and geopolitical rivalry. Drake was celebrated not as a rogue pirate but as an agent of state, heroic, righteous, and reliable. Broadsides, poems, and images immortalized his daring, contributing to a growing sense of English exceptionalism in maritime affairs. This sense of exceptionality evolved into an imperial mindset, that England had divine destiny and commercial license to claim territory, civilize populations, and lead opposition to Catholic empire. Though the Tudors didn't yet control vast colonies, their voyages sowed the seeds for later imperial systems. The notion of territorial sovereignty overseas, state-chartered exploration companies, and the celebration of naval heroes foreshadowed the rise of the British Empire in the 17th and 18th centuries. Culturally, these efforts reshaped English identity. Language celebrated maritime daring. Literature and drama depicted voyages and exotic lands as sources of national pride. Maps, reports, and excited accounts from returning sailors stirred the collective imagination. London residents, once provincial, found themselves connected to a global network, believing in England's right to explore and expand. The ship logistics also laid technical foundations. Improvements in shipbuilding, navigation, and sailing techniques became national competencies, shared and developed by naval and merchant enterprises alike. Economically, early voyages cultivated hubs of global trade. Although Spain and Portugal dominated, England increasingly accessed precious resources, tobacco, sugar, fur, timber, minerals, through licensed expeditions and emerging settlers. This diversification of trade boosted domestic economies and fueled demand for more voyages, accelerating competition. Politically, the Tudor state model emerged as a prototype of imperial governance. Strategic royal patents, military naval backing, chartered companies, and a narrative framed around divine mission and nationhood. Explorers' ventures reflected both crown interests and private capital, foreshadowing hybrid governance mechanisms central to later British colonial administration. Beyond economics and politics, the expeditions reshaped England's global interactions. Early challenges to Spanish maritime supremacy and the assertion of sovereignty in North America established precedents later expanded into full imperial establishment. These expeditions reshaped indigenous societies, introduced European legal systems, and restructured global trade networks, early steps toward globalization. In retrospect, figures like Cabot, Drake, and Raleigh were not isolated adventurers but symbolized the launch of English imperial vision. Cabot opened the door, Drake seized maritime power, Raleigh attempted to walk through it. These explorers acted as catalysts for cultural shift, turning curiosity into policy, voyages into strategy, ultimately shaping the imperial mindset that propelled England onto the world stage. Thus, the Tudor foundations of maritime expansion were critical. They merged navigation, enterprise, military, and political ambition into a coherent framework. By embedding exploration within statecraft and cultural identity, the Tudors seeded England's transformation into a maritime empire, and in doing so, shaped much of the modern world's political and economic contours. During the Tudor era, especially under the reigns of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, propaganda took on a refined and deliberate role in the projection of royal power and national identity. The monarchs and their advisors harnessed the visual and performative arts to communicate political messages, enforce legitimacy, and cultivate loyalty among subjects. This was a period of rising literacy, the expansion of printing, and the increasing importance of visual culture, allowing the Tudors to manipulate public perception with unprecedented sophistication. Though the term propaganda is modern, the techniques employed during the Tudor period would not feel out of place in today's political media landscape. Portraiture became one of the most potent tools of this visual strategy. For monarchs whose personal presence was geographically limited in a time before mass media, their portraits acted as surrogate bodies, carefully curated images of authority, stability, and virtue. Henry VIII, perhaps more than any English king before him, understood the importance of controlling his image. One of the most influential artists in his service was Hans Holbein the Younger, whose portraits of Henry shaped the monarch's reputation as a powerful and unchallengeable sovereign. In Holbein's famous 1537 portrait, now lost but widely reproduced, Henry stands with an assertive stance, broad-shouldered and richly dressed, eyes piercing forward. This image, replicated in engravings and miniature paintings, projected not only kingly power but divine right, masculinity, and fearlessness. It served both internal and external purposes, to impress subjects and to intimidate rivals abroad. This visual culture evolved further under Elizabeth I, who inherited a kingdom fractured by religious division and political instability. Elizabeth's unmarried status and lack of an heir posed challenges to traditional notions of dynastic strength, but her government turned this potential liability into a symbol of unique national identity. Portraits of Elizabeth were not realistic likenesses but idealized representations that carried rich layers of symbolism. In the Armada portrait painted after England's 1588 victory over the Spanish Armada, Elizabeth I shone in sumptuous clothing, her hand resting on a globe, symbolizing both her dominion and the expanding reach of England's maritime ambitions. Her elaborate gowns were embroidered with eyes and ears, suggesting omnipresence. Pearls, a symbol of chastity, reinforced her image as the Virgin Queen. These carefully managed portrayals were never just personal glorifications, they were state propaganda. The government controlled the distribution of royal portraits, and artists worked from official templates. By disseminating these images to noble households, civic buildings, and universities, the crown effectively ensured a consistent, idealized vision of the monarchy throughout the realm. The Queen's image became a tool to foster loyalty, suggest divine favor, and promote a sense of continuity and national unity. Elizabeth's unmarried status was spun as a sign of her devotion to England itself, married to her kingdom, thus elevating patriotism to a quasi-religious experience centered around the monarch. Complementing the visual arts, the Tudors mastered the use of court pageantry and public spectacle to shape public perception and reinforce authority. Royal progresses, tournaments, masks, and coronation ceremonies were stages upon which the monarch could appear before the people in carefully controlled contexts. These events were highly choreographed, designed to evoke wonder, allegiance, and gratitude. They also functioned as strategic public relations tools. During royal progresses, Elizabeth traveled across the country, particularly to the homes of loyal nobles. These visits showcased the Queen's grace and power, while also allowing her to reinforce bonds of loyalty and keep potential dissenters in check through personal engagement. Masks and theatrical performances in the court were also imbued with political symbolism. Court playwrights embedded subtle commentaries on governance, virtue, and national destiny within dramatic form. The monarch often appeared as the climax or the final arbiter of justice, reinforcing the idea that peace and order flowed from royal wisdom. These spectacles were not limited to elite audiences. Through printed accounts, word-of-mouth retellings, and public festivals, the messages reached broader audiences, embedding the monarchy more deeply into the cultural consciousness of the people. The control of printed media was another dimension of Tudor propaganda. With the advent of the printing press, the monarchy recognized the power of pamphlets, proclamations, and sermons. Government-approved texts portrayed the Tudor regime as divinely ordained and morally righteous. During the religious upheavals of the Reformation and the Elizabethan settlement, the written word became crucial in swaying public opinion. Authorized versions of the Bible, prayers, and liturgical texts reinforced the monarch's position as head of the Church of England. These publications standardized religious and political orthodoxy, allowing the monarchy to guide not only civic loyalty but also spiritual authority. The consistency of messaging, whether in paintings, performances, or publications, was a hallmark of Tudor propaganda. Even acts of suppression, such as the execution of traitors or religious dissenters, were staged for maximum psychological impact. Public executions were not only punishments but also performances designed to deter opposition and dramatize the monarch's justice. Similarly, the construction of royal palaces and civic architecture reflected grandeur and stability, embodying the centrality of the monarchy in the physical and emotional landscape of the country. The methods of image-making and message control developed by the Tudors bear striking resemblance to modern political media strategies. Just as Tudor monarchs commissioned artists to depict them in idealized forms, contemporary leaders employ photographers, videographers, and public relations teams to manage their visual presence. Press releases, political advertisements, televised speeches, and curated social media feeds perform the same essential function as Tudor portraits: to present a controlled, favorable version of leadership that fosters trust, power, and allegiance. Today's political pageantry, such as national conventions, state visits, and televised debates, also echoes the performative spectacles of the Tudor court. These events are meticulously staged to project authority, relatability, or vision. Like the royal progresses of Elizabeth I, modern political campaigns tour the country, engaging directly with the populace to build trust and personal connection. Politicians employ symbols, flags, slogans, carefully chosen attire, to communicate implicit messages about character, values, and patriotism. Furthermore, the use of public narratives to manage personal weakness has not changed. Elizabeth's unmarried status was transformed into the empowering myth of the Virgin Queen. Similarly, contemporary leaders often reframe potentially negative traits, whether age, background, or political compromise, as strengths or unique assets to connect with the public. The construction of identity, and its strategic dissemination, remains central to political success. Even the realm of censorship and information control, managed in the Tudor period through royal licensing of printers and sanctioned preachers, finds its modern parallels in the regulation of media, the crafting of party-line narratives, and the management of press access. While the tools have changed, from parchment to social media algorithms, the goal remains: to influence perception, shape loyalty, and control the flow of information. The Tudor use of image and spectacle was not only a defining feature of their governance but a legacy that has shaped the relationship between power and media ever since. Their mastery of visual culture, performative politics, and message consistency created an enduring model for how leaders communicate with subjects and citizens alike. Though centuries removed from today's digital landscapes, the core principles of Tudor propaganda, centralized control, symbolism, idealization, and repetition, continue to animate political image-making in the modern world. The Tudor court served as more than a political nerve center. It was the cultural heartbeat of England during the 16th century. Under the reigns of Henry VII, Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, and particularly Elizabeth I, England experienced a dramatic flourishing of the arts. Music, drama, literature, and visual expression became tools not only of entertainment but of political expression, identity formation, and national prestige. What occurred was not an accidental blossoming of creativity but a calculated and intentional development encouraged by royal patronage and cultivated in the halls of court. The rulers of the Tudor period recognized that cultural vitality could be wielded as a form of influence, what today we might call soft power. Through the shaping of artistic expression, the Tudor monarchy helped forge a distinctly English identity and contributed to a legacy that would echo far beyond their time. Music, as one of the most accessible and widespread forms of artistic engagement in the 16th century, was deeply embedded in both courtly ritual and religious practice. Under Henry VIII, who was himself a talented musician and composer, the English court became a dynamic hub for musical innovation. Henry amassed a sizable collection of instruments, employed foreign musicians, and contributed to the development of native musical styles. The king composed pieces such as Pastime with Good Company, which reflected not just leisure but the court's cultivated ethos of refined enjoyment and disciplined artistry. Sacred music thrived under his reign and continued into the Elizabethan era, although it evolved considerably in response to religious shifts. The composers Thomas Tallis and William Byrd adapted brilliantly to the changing religious climate, creating Protestant and Catholic pieces as required. Their music became a symbol of cultural excellence, blending devotional intensity with national prestige, and proving that art could be both theologically functional and politically resonant. Drama was arguably the most powerful medium of expression to emerge during the Tudor period, and its impact remains monumental today. The rise of public theatres in London, most famously the Globe, coincided with the maturation of a dramatic tradition that would culminate in the works of William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and Ben Jonson. Yet their talent did not develop in isolation. It was the result of a thriving ecosystem of courtly and civic patronage. The Queen herself became a crucial figure in supporting the theatrical arts. Her courtiers, nobles such as the Earl of Leicester and the Earl of Southampton, sponsored acting troupes that performed both at court and in public venues. These troupes helped elevate the status of drama from a form of populist entertainment to an instrument of political reflection and national education. Shakespeare's works, in particular, exemplify how Tudor patronage enabled the development of a cultural voice that was both artistic and political. In plays such as Henry V, Richard III, and Macbeth, Shakespeare explored the nature of kingship, the legitimacy of rule, and the costs of ambition and rebellion, questions that were deeply relevant to a society still grappling with the aftermath of dynastic conflict and religious division. His nuanced portrayals of historical figures allowed the audience to reflect on contemporary political concerns through a safely veiled lens. Even his comedies and romances were imbued with concerns about order, hierarchy, and harmony, values that resonated with Elizabethan ideals. Christopher Marlowe, another titan of Elizabethan drama, took a more provocative approach. In plays like Dr. Faustus and Tamburlaine, he interrogated ambition, power, and the human condition with intensity and intellectual daring. Though his life was cut short under mysterious circumstances, his work exemplified the era's spirit of intellectual risk-taking and artistic boldness. Meanwhile, Edmund Spenser brought epic poetry into the Tudor artistic canon with The Faerie Queene, a vast allegorical poem that paid homage to Elizabeth I while constructing a mythologized England steeped in virtue and valor. Spenser's work was explicitly nationalist in character, designed to celebrate the English Reformation and the triumph of Protestant morality over Catholic corruption. His patronage by the Queen and leading nobles reflected the close ties between literature and political ideology in the Tudor court. This fusion of art and ideology laid the groundwork for early nationalism in English culture. Prior to the Tudors, English identity was less cohesive, fragmented by regional dialects, aristocratic rivalries, and foreign entanglements. But through shared literary forms, standardized religious texts like the Book of Common Prayer, and the emergence of a national theatrical tradition, England began to envision itself as a unified cultural entity. The English language itself was elevated by the literary achievements of the period, solidifying its place as a worthy vehicle for high art and intellectual discourse. Writers no longer felt the need to write in Latin or French to be taken seriously. Instead, they claimed English as a legitimate, powerful, and beautiful means of expression. The court's role in this transformation cannot be overstated. Royal patronage didn't merely provide funding, it conferred legitimacy. Artists, musicians, and playwrights who received royal favor were assured of both financial security and cultural prestige. More importantly, the court acted as a cultural arbiter, setting trends and expectations that shaped artistic output throughout the country. The aesthetic preferences of Elizabeth I, for instance, dictated stylistic norms in portraiture, poetry, and even court fashion. Artists aligned themselves with the ideals she embodied: chastity, wisdom, political cunning, and national loyalty. In this sense, the court functioned as both museum and academy, a space of cultural refinement and political symbolism. Beyond the walls of court, the impact of this patronage radiated outward into broader society. Public access to performances, printed texts, and music meant that even those who had never seen the Queen could feel part of a shared national culture. Artistic expressions fostered a sense of collective identity, reinforcing loyalty to the crown and the emerging Protestant English state. The widespread performance of history plays and morality tales helped internalize narratives of English virtue, destiny, and exceptionalism among the general populace. This legacy continues to reverberate in modern understandings of cultural diplomacy and soft power. The use of cultural patronage by the Tudors was a forerunner to modern strategies wherein states use the arts to project influence, foster international goodwill, and shape global perceptions. Just as Elizabeth I elevated England's status through the symbolic capital of a vibrant court culture, contemporary nations fund film, music, literature, and architecture to assert their identity and values on the global stage. Furthermore, the Tudor model demonstrated how the arts could be employed not simply to reflect society but to actively shape it. Through allegory, spectacle, and emotional resonance, the works created under Tudor patronage helped forge a new vision of England, one where art served the crown and in doing so, elevated the nation. The very idea of a national literature, a concept now common across the world, owes much to the deliberate cultivation of artistic identity during this time. The Tudor court's investment in cultural patronage transformed not only the arts themselves but the place of art in society. It aligned creativity with authority, imagination with ideology, and beauty with power. By embedding cultural expression into the political life of the realm, the Tudors laid a foundation upon which centuries of English and later British identity would be constructed. The music, literature, and drama born in the Tudor era continue to shape the global perception of English cultural heritage and demonstrate the enduring potency of artistic patronage as a force in national development. The Tudor period marked a profound transformation in England's economic structure, moving decisively away from the medieval feudal economy toward early forms of capitalism. This era, spanning from 1485 to 1603, witnessed structural changes that laid the groundwork for the emergence of a market-oriented society, shaped new social classes, redefined land use, and introduced financial mechanisms that would eventually support England's rise as a global economic power. One of the most fundamental changes during the Tudor era was the shift from a primarily agrarian, subsistence-based feudal economy to one increasingly driven by market forces. Under feudalism, land was the main source of wealth, and economic activity revolved around obligations between lords and vassals. Peasants worked on manorial estates in exchange for protection and a share of the harvest. However, by the late 15th and early 16th centuries, this model began to erode. The aftermath of the Black Death had already diminished the labor force, empowering surviving workers to demand wages and move in search of better opportunities. This mobility began to undermine traditional feudal bonds. The dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII played a crucial role in this transformation. With the expropriation of monastic lands, vast tracts of property were transferred from religious institutions to private hands, particularly to members of the rising gentry and merchant classes. These new landowners often took a more profit-oriented approach, leasing land to tenant farmers and maximizing revenues through enclosure and sheep farming. The enclosure movement, where communal lands were fenced off and converted to private use, displaced many smallholders and commoners, pushing them toward urban centers or wage labor. While this caused social dislocation and hardship for many, it also created a more flexible labor market and spurred economic dynamism. As landholding patterns changed, a new class of wealthy merchants and entrepreneurs began to rise. This burgeoning merchant class was no longer confined to trade in local goods or domestic markets. Thanks to maritime exploration and overseas trade routes, they began importing and exporting goods on a much broader scale. English merchants traded wool, cloth, tin and other commodities with Europe, particularly the Low Countries and the Baltic states. The establishment of trading companies such as the Muscovy Company and the Eastland Company toward the end of the Tudor era demonstrated the beginnings of organized international trade. These companies operated under royal charters, providing not only economic opportunities but also political protection and incentives for further expansion. The development of the cloth industry was a particular driver of economic change. Wool had long been England's most important export, but by the 16th century, raw wool increasingly gave way to finished cloth as the principal product. This stimulated domestic industry and led to the growth of regional cloth-producing towns. As these towns grew, they became centers of capital investment, skilled labor and entrepreneurial innovation. The expansion of cloth production also encouraged the development of new financial instruments, such as credit systems and bills of exchange, which facilitated long-distance trade and reduced dependence on hard currency. The Tudor government played an active role in shaping economic policy, often with the aim of increasing state revenue and national stability. Taxation systems were restructured, with the crown seeking to expand its revenue base beyond feudal dues and royal estates. Henry VII initiated fiscal reforms that emphasized efficiency and control, often relying on bonds and recognizances to manage noble behavior and finances. Later, under Henry VIII and his successors, increasing demands for war and court expenditure led to heavy reliance on taxes, including the unpopular subsidy system. The tax base was widened to include wealthier members of the commoner classes, reflecting the growing importance of commerce and trade in the economy. Another significant change involved the management and ownership of land. The Enclosure Acts, often passed locally but encouraged by a sympathetic parliament, allowed landlords to consolidate scattered holdings and use the land more intensively. This was often directed toward sheep grazing, which required fewer workers and generated higher profits, especially with the demand for wool and cloth on the rise. While profitable for landowners, enclosure caused severe disruption for those dependent on common land for their livelihoods, contributing to rural poverty, vagabondage, and periodic uprisings such as Kett's Rebellion in 1549. At the same time, towns and cities began to play a more central role in the economy. Urban centers expanded as rural populations migrated in search of work. London, in particular, grew rapidly, becoming a hub of commerce, finance, and manufacturing. The increase in urbanization laid the groundwork for proto-industrialization, a phase in which small-scale industry began to emerge, often organized around domestic or workshop production rather than large factories. This shift was especially visible in industries such as cloth-making, metallurgy, and shipbuilding. Workers produced goods for both local consumption and export, linking rural and urban economies more tightly than before. With the growth of commerce, wealth was no longer derived solely from land. Capital investment in trade, shipping, and production opened up new paths to economic success, challenging the traditional dominance of the landed aristocracy. Wealthy merchants could now rise to social prominence, marrying into noble families or purchasing titles and estates. This social fluidity represented a quiet revolution in the fabric of English society, as economic power began to supplement and even rival hereditary status. The growing importance of trade also fostered a more outward-looking economic mentality. English merchants began to venture beyond traditional European markets, seeking opportunities in Russia, Africa, and the Americas. These early explorations laid the foundations for what would become the British Empire. While the full colonial apparatus was not yet in place, the seeds of imperial trade networks were being sown during the late Tudor period. The development of ports, improvement of navigational tools, and accumulation of maritime experience all contributed to England's growing commercial ambitions. The combination of these economic trends reshaped the structure of society and governance. The Tudor state had to adapt to a more complex, diversified economy that could not be managed through feudal principles alone. The Crown's increasing reliance on taxation from trade and industry drew it into closer alignment with the interests of merchants and the urban bourgeoisie. Over time, this would influence political developments, contributing to the rise of Parliament as a body representing commercial as well as aristocratic interests. The Tudor period marked a crucial turning point in England's economic development. The decline of feudalism, the rise of a market economy, the growth of a powerful merchant class, changes in land ownership, and the beginnings of industrial and overseas trade all converged to reshape the country's economic landscape. These transformations laid the structural foundations for capitalism and imperial expansion, setting England on a path toward becoming one of the world's leading economic powers in the centuries to come. The legacy of Tudor economic change is thus not only a matter of financial reform or trade policy, but a fundamental reordering of English society itself. During the Tudor period, particularly under the reigns of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, England underwent a transformative shift in its approach to military organization and naval power. This transformation laid the groundwork for the rise of England and later Britain as a dominant global military force. Central to this evolution was the development of a permanent navy, advances in shipbuilding, the refinement of naval tactics, and the integration of maritime strength into national defense policy. These innovations were not isolated military reforms but part of a broader vision that connected maritime power to political sovereignty, economic security, and imperial ambition. Prior to the Tudors, England did not possess a standing navy in any modern sense. Naval forces were assembled on an ad hoc basis, usually by requisitioning merchant ships in times of war. This system was inconsistent, unreliable, and vulnerable to the fluctuating loyalties and resources of local lords and traders. Recognizing the strategic disadvantage this posed, Henry VIII made a bold and visionary decision to establish a permanent naval force. He invested heavily in the construction of purpose-built warships, creating what would become the Royal Navy. This initiative was more than a military endeavor, it was a declaration of national strength and technological ambition. Henry VIII's investment in dockyards, particularly at Portsmouth, and the establishment of the Navy Board to oversee ship maintenance and construction, marked a foundational moment in the institutionalization of naval power. His fleet included some of the first ships designed specifically for naval warfare, such as the Mary Rose, which featured gunports built into the hull, a revolutionary innovation at the time. This allowed ships to deliver broadside cannon fire, transforming sea battles from chaotic boarding skirmishes into contests of firepower and maneuver. The construction of large, heavily armed vessels signified a new age in maritime conflict, where naval supremacy could decide the outcome of wars and secure the economic lifelines of trade routes and colonies. Alongside physical ships, tactical doctrines evolved to match the changing nature of naval warfare. During the early Tudor period, naval tactics still resembled those of the medieval world, where close-quarter combat and boarding actions dominated. However, by the end of Elizabeth I's reign, there was a clear shift toward artillery-based combat and fleet coordination. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 stands as a defining moment in this transformation. English ships, which were smaller, faster, and more maneuverable than the massive Spanish galleons, employed hit-and-run tactics and superior gunnery to disrupt and scatter the invading fleet. Leadership from seasoned seafarers like Sir Francis Drake and Lord Charles Howard played a crucial role, but so too did the technological advantage offered by English ship design and firepower. The Armada's failure was not merely a tactical victory, it was a psychological and symbolic triumph that affirmed the value of maritime investment. It showed that naval strength could serve as a bulwark against foreign invasion, a tool of deterrence, and a platform for projecting national influence. The experience gained from the conflict also highlighted the importance of training, logistics, and coordination among fleets. These lessons would be integrated into future naval planning, contributing to a professionalized maritime force that could be sustained and expanded as England's global interests grew. Shipbuilding, in particular, advanced rapidly under the Tudors, not only in scale and firepower but also in craftsmanship and design. Innovations in hull construction, rigging, and navigational tools allowed ships to travel farther, faster, and with greater reliability. The adoption of the galleon, a sleek and versatile design that balanced cargo space with combat capabilities, became the standard for long voyages and naval encounters. This not only enhanced England's ability to defend its coastlines but also enabled exploratory and commercial ventures abroad. As naval capability increased, so did the integration of military strategy with national policy. The Tudor state began to perceive control of the seas as essential to its security and prosperity. Maritime power allowed for the protection of merchant fleets, the enforcement of trade monopolies, and the projection of English interests in contested waters such as the English Channel and the North Sea. The establishment of fortified coastal defenses, including a chain of castles ordered by Henry VIII, further reflected the growing awareness of England's vulnerability and the need for comprehensive maritime security. In addition to external threats, naval power had internal political significance. The ability of the Crown to control and mobilize a national navy symbolized centralized authority. Unlike land-based military forces, which often depended on the loyalty of regional magnates, the navy was a royal institution from its inception. This helped reinforce the monarchy's dominance over domestic rivals and cemented the connection between national defense and sovereign rule. The navy in this sense became a key pillar of statecraft, providing the monarchy with a strategic edge both at home and abroad. The long-term implications of Tudor naval development are far-reaching. The foundations laid in this period enabled England to transition into a maritime empire in the following centuries. The practices, institutions, and technological advancements established during the Tudor era were expanded under the Stuarts and fully realized during the age of the British Empire. Naval dominance allowed Britain to colonize vast territories, control global trade routes, and intervene decisively in European conflicts. The Royal Navy would go on to become the most powerful naval force in the world, a status it maintained for over 2 centuries. Moreover, the cultural and ideological importance of naval power became ingrained in the national consciousness. Maritime success was celebrated in literature, ballads, and political rhetoric. Figures like Drake and Raleigh were elevated to the status of national heroes, and the image of Britannia ruling the waves took root in the collective imagination. This mythology was not simply romanticism. It served to justify and perpetuate policies of naval expansion and imperial conquest. The Tudor period represents the birth of English naval power as a permanent and strategic component of statecraft. Through investments in shipbuilding, tactical evolution, institutional reform, and national vision, the Tudors transformed England from a vulnerable island nation into a budding maritime power. The trajectory set in motion by Henry VIII and Elizabeth I would shape centuries of global history, ensuring that control of the seas remained a defining feature of British influence in the world. This legacy, of innovation, ambition, and strategic foresight, cements the Tudor contribution to the military evolution of modern Britain. The Tudor period, spanning from 1485 to 1603, brought about a significant transformation in how law, order, and social governance were managed in England. These changes formed a cornerstone of the modern British legal and policing systems. During this era, the monarchy sought to centralize authority and extend its influence into local affairs, using legal and administrative reforms to enforce order and stability across the realm. The foundation of local governance was laid with the development of the justice of the peace system, while poor laws introduced during this time began to shape the early welfare state. Together, these reforms left a deep and lasting imprint on how contemporary societies approach issues of law enforcement, justice, and social responsibility. At the heart of Tudor local governance was the justice of the peace (JP) system. JPs were typically drawn from the ranks of the landed gentry, and their role was to uphold royal authority at the county level. Their appointment was a strategic move by the Crown to create a loyal administrative class that could execute the monarch's policies in areas where direct royal oversight was impractical. These local officials held considerable powers. They presided over quarter sessions, heard criminal cases, supervised markets, regulated wages, and enforced laws passed by Parliament. Their authority extended across both judicial and administrative domains, blending legal enforcement with civil governance. One of the most important characteristics of the JP system was its cost-effectiveness. The crown relied on unpaid, part-time officials who were expected to govern out of a sense of duty and loyalty. This allowed for a wide reach of governmental control without the financial burden of a salaried bureaucracy. At the same time, the JPs became powerful figures in their local communities, bridging the gap between central authority and the rural populace. They were instrumental in disseminating royal proclamations and ensuring compliance with Tudor legislation, creating a model of local administration that has persisted in various forms into modern times. The use of JPs as local enforcers also helped establish the precedent for community-based policing. Although they did not patrol the streets like modern police officers, their responsibilities in maintaining order, investigating complaints, and coordinating local constables created the framework for policing at a grassroots level. Parish constables, who were subordinate to the JPs, were often chosen from among local householders and served short terms. They were responsible for arresting offenders, organizing watchmen, and ensuring peace during public events. While rudimentary by contemporary standards, these mechanisms reflected a growing belief in structured, locally accountable law enforcement, laying the groundwork for later professional police forces. Simultaneously, the Tudor period witnessed significant developments in social policy, particularly through the introduction and evolution of poor laws. The late 15th and early 16th centuries saw rising poverty, vagrancy, and unemployment, exacerbated by population growth, inflation, and the effects of land enclosure. The traditional medieval system of charity, administered by the Church, began to falter, especially after the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII. With ecclesiastical institutions no longer serving as the primary providers of relief, the state stepped in to manage the growing crisis of poverty. The poor laws that emerged during the Tudor era represented a novel approach to social welfare. Initially punitive in nature, laws such as the Vagabonds and Beggars Act of 1495 sought to control the movement and behavior of the unemployed, distinguishing between the deserving and undeserving poor. Those deemed able-bodied but unwilling to work faced harsh punishments, including whipping and imprisonment. However, over time, the policy began to shift toward a more organized and constructive model of relief. Under the Elizabethan Poor Law of 1601, the state formalized a system in which each parish was responsible for caring for its poor. Overseers of the poor were appointed to collect taxes, assess needs, and distribute aid in the form of food, clothing, and work opportunities. This legislation effectively created a national framework for welfare that relied on local implementation. Though rooted in moral and religious ideology, the system also reflected a practical understanding of the need to manage poverty in a structured way to prevent disorder and rebellion. This approach had lasting implications. The Tudor model of parish-based welfare administration influenced later reforms in Britain and elsewhere, introducing the principle that the state bears some responsibility for the well-being of its citizens. The division between those deemed eligible for support and those considered idle or criminal also foreshadowed ongoing debates in modern welfare systems about entitlement, responsibility, and the role of the government. In parallel with these welfare reforms, Tudor governance also laid the foundation for the rule of law as a central principle of the state. By formalizing legal processes and expanding the reach of statutes passed by Parliament, the period marked a shift from arbitrary royal justice to a more codified and uniform legal structure. JPs, operating under royal commissions and bound by statute, ensured that laws were applied consistently, if not always fairly. The law increasingly became an instrument not just of justice but of social control, used to mold behavior and enforce conformity to the Tudor vision of order. Another important legacy of this period was the increased professionalization of legal roles. While still a long way from the full-fledged legal profession of later centuries, the Tudor era saw a growing reliance on trained lawyers, especially in the higher courts. This emphasis on legal knowledge and procedure contributed to the development of English common law and the precedent-based legal system still in use today. The intertwining of legal authority with state governance during this time helped create an enduring link between law and national identity. Furthermore, the Tudor approach to governance emphasized surveillance and accountability. Regular reports, inquiries, and the dissemination of royal mandates through JPs and other local officials created a network of oversight that allowed the Crown to maintain control across a geographically dispersed population. This early form of administrative centralization can be seen as a precursor to modern bureaucratic governance, where local offices implement national policies under state supervision. The Tudor contributions to law, order, and social policy were transformative. Through the justice of the peace system, the monarchy extended its reach into local communities, creating a model of governance that balanced centralized authority with local administration. The development of the Poor Laws introduced the idea of a structured, state-supported welfare system, marking the beginning of governmental responsibility for social care. At the same time, innovations in law enforcement, legal procedure and local oversight foreshadowed the emergence of modern policing and judicial systems. These legacies, forged in an era of significant social and political change, continue to shape the structures and philosophies of governance in the contemporary world. Over the course of the Tudor dynasty, roughly from the late 15th to the early 17th century, England experienced a remarkable cultural and intellectual renaissance, marked by the flourishing of language and literature, the rise of early scientific and medical inquiry, and the gradual shift towards a more empirical worldview. These dual chapters represent a bridge between medieval tradition and early modern thought, one that would shape not only England but the future trajectory of Western civilization. First, the English Renaissance saw the language itself take center stage. The invention of the printing press in 1476 by William Caxton was transformative. By making printed texts more widely available in English rather than Latin or French, Caxton helped standardize spelling and syntax, particularly through the widespread use of the London dialect, and expanded the reach of literature beyond the elite. This technological shift dovetailed with the Protestant Reformation, as the translation of religious texts, most notably Tyndale's New Testament and the Geneva Bible, encouraged literacy, infused new vocabulary drawn from theology, and empowered individuals to engage with Scripture independently. Humanist scholars, inspired by continental models, nurtured a respect for classical languages and wrote in a refined prose style. Figures like Roger Ascham, who tutored Elizabeth I, promoted a blend of Latin rigor and English clarity, encouraging critical thinking alongside eloquence. At the same time, translators and lexicographers such as John Florio infused English with Italianate and Latin terms, enriching its expressive power and even contributing over 1,000 new words to the language. Literature and drama thrived. Early playwrights like Marlowe and Sidney were quickly followed by Shakespeare and Spenser. Spenser's The Faerie Queene, a richly allegorical epic in English, celebrated Tudor ideals of virtue and national identity and helped define the nation's literary voice. Shakespeare, whose rich vocabulary and mastery of human emotion set new standards, penned works that reshaped the global perception of English literature. Drama, imbued with classical forms and vernacular vitality, became a vehicle not only for entertainment but also for political and moral reflection. This period thus saw English evolve into a language of culture, politics, commerce, and scholarship. Its spread was facilitated by printed books, carried by merchants, diplomats, and religious communities, establishing England's language as a global medium of influence. Alongside linguistic transformation, the Tudors fostered early scientific and medical innovation. Renaissance humanism prompted scholars to question received wisdom and to revive classical sources. While magic and alchemy remained entwined with early inquiry, the emphasis on observation began to emerge. John Dee, court astrologer to Elizabeth I, embodied this blend of mysticism and emerging science. Although he delved into alchemy and divination, Dee also championed navigational math and urged colonial expansion under a new English empire, coining the term British Empire. His extensive library and correspondence fostered scholarly exchange across Europe. This period also saw early vestiges of the experimental approach that would mature later. Francis Bacon, though active slightly later, began to articulate a method grounded in careful experimentation and inductive reasoning, a precursor to the scientific method. Meanwhile, university curricula started including observational natural philosophy alongside theology, setting the foundations for later empirical developments. The Tudors thus elevated science from scholastic speculation to a curious intellectual discipline. While not yet strictly experimental, early scholars were moving toward systematic observation, blending mystical inquiry with pragmatic study, a transitional moment on the way to modern science. Together, these developments placed language, literature, and learning at the heart of national identity and statecraft. English became a polished medium capable of expressing complex ideas, not only poetic and dramatic, but also philosophical and scientific. The interplay of humanist ideals and empirical inquiry created an intellectual climate that valued both classical wisdom and innovative thought. This dual inheritance empowered later institutions, printing, translation, universities, scientific societies, to flourish. By the dawn of the 17th century, England stood as a nexus of cultural and intellectual growth. The waves begun by Renaissance scholarship, poetic innovation, and early science would wash across the globe, exporting English language and literature, scientific thought, and a model of discourse that blended humanistic reflection with empirical observation. The Tudor-era expansions of language and knowledge, themselves intertwined, would be central threads in the tapestry of the modern world, anchoring not only Britain's cultural legacy but its intellectual leadership in the centuries to follow. The Tudor Renaissance and its embrace of empirical natural philosophy reshaped English society by empowering the vernacular, enriching literature, and nurturing a mindset drawn toward discovery. These transformations planted the seeds for both the global influence of English and the eventual rise of modern science, positioning Tudor England as a cultural and intellectual crucible for the modern era. Over the course of the Tudor dynasty, roughly from the late 15th to the early 17th century, England experienced a remarkable cultural and intellectual renaissance, marked by the flourishing of language and literature, the rise of early scientific and medical inquiry, and the gradual shift towards a more empirical worldview. This period also saw early vestiges of the experimental approach that would mature later. Francis Bacon, though active slightly later, began to articulate a method grounded in careful experimentation and inductive reasoning. A precursor to the scientific methodized this complexity. While dabbling in astrology and alchemy, Dee championed mathematical navigation and advocated colonial expansion using empirical tools. He even introduced the term British Empire, fusing exploration and national destiny through rational planning. Paracelsian medicine disrupted traditional Galenic orthodoxy by favoring chemical remedies calibrated to disease processes. Practitioners like Robert Fludd navigated mystical philosophy, alchemy, and early chemical medicine, helping steer English intellectual life toward practical examination of health. This signaled a move away from purely textual authority toward hands-on experimentation and observation. Universities and informal scholars increasingly embraced observational natural philosophy. Elements of inductive logic, encouraged by humanists and later systematized by Francis Bacon, though somewhat after the Tudor era, began shaping English scholarship. Bacon's proposals for collecting data, forming generalizations, and testing universal principles laid the groundwork for what would become the scientific method. Although early science was still interwoven with mysticism, the Tudor period represented a crucial inflection point. Science gradually became legitimized as a state-prioritized pursuit. The court's interest in navigation and medicine served political and commercial needs, bolstering the perception that knowledge about the natural world mattered, not only for religious knowledge but also for empire, trade, industry, and national strength. Together, these twin revolutions of language and inquiry created a cultural synergy. A more powerful vernacular supported deeper reflection in literature and political thought. Printing and exploration spread it worldwide. Meanwhile, empirical science signaled a cultural respect for observation, experimentation, and applied knowledge. England emerged as a place where humanist literary excellence and nascent scientific reasoning gained equal value, often housed under the same roof of courtly patronage. By the early 17th century, England stood on the cusp of becoming a modern power, culturally confident, intellectually dynamic, and scientifically inquisitive. Global dissemination of the English language from North America to the Indian Ocean was underway, carried by both merchants and scholars. Meanwhile, the scientific mind, with its combination of wonder, discipline, and method, would find fuller expression in the Royal Society under later monarchs. Thus, the Tudor period planted the seeds of global influence through cultural and intellectual renewal. English language and literature became vehicles for national self-awareness and international dialogue. Science, medicine, and natural philosophy edged toward empirical legitimacy, laying a foundation that would enable the Enlightenment and colonial science. This era represents a formative moment where humanist elegance met scientific method, giving the modern world two of its most enduring legacies, a global lingua franca and a coherent approach to understanding reality. The Tudor era in England was marked by dramatic and often violent religious upheaval that would leave a lasting legacy on both national identity and modern ideas of tolerance and intolerance. As the country moved from Catholic orthodoxy under Henry VIII and Mary I to Protestant ascendancy under Edward VII and Elizabeth I, the shifting religious policies created a turbulent and polarized environment. These oscillations not only led to persecution and social division but also sparked the conditions in which concepts of religious coexistence, individual conscience, and state neutrality would later develop. This complex interplay of intolerance and evolving tolerance became a key precursor to Enlightenment ideas and the gradual emergence of modern secularism. The reign of Mary I from 1553 to 1558 is often remembered for her zealous efforts to restore Catholicism and her brutal suppression of Protestant dissenters. As the daughter of Catherine of Aragon and a devout Catholic, Mary viewed her accession as a divine mandate to undo the Protestant reforms introduced by her father Henry VIII and half-brother Edward VI. Her regime initiated a sweeping campaign to re-establish papal authority in England. Hundreds of Protestants, including influential figures like Thomas Cranmer, were burned at the stake under heresy laws. These executions, often conducted in public, were intended as moral spectacles and deterrents, but they had the opposite effect for many observers. Rather than stifling Protestantism, Mary's actions created martyrs whose stories were recorded and widely disseminated, most notably in John Foxe's Book of Martyrs. The perception of Catholicism as cruel and authoritarian became ingrained in the English Protestant consciousness, shaping anti-Catholic sentiment for generations. In contrast, the accession of Elizabeth I in 1558 marked a strategic and more politically astute approach to the religious divide. Elizabeth's settlement, often referred to as the Middle Way, aimed to stabilize England by forging a Protestant national church that retained enough traditional elements to appease moderate Catholics. The 1559 Act of Supremacy reasserted the monarch's role as head of the Church of England, while the Act of Uniformity mandated attendance at Anglican services and enforced the use of the Book of Common Prayer. These measures sought to unify the country under a common religious framework without provoking civil unrest. While this policy of moderation helped prevent open religious war, it was not truly tolerant in the modern sense. Recusants, those who refused to attend Anglican services, faced fines, property confiscation, and sometimes imprisonment. The threat of Catholic plots, especially after the papal excommunication of Elizabeth in 1570, intensified persecution. Priests trained abroad were hunted as traitors, and harboring them became a capital offense. Though Elizabeth may have been personally indifferent to some religious differences, her government enforced conformity as a matter of national security and political control. Tolerance was extended not out of respect for pluralism but as a pragmatic necessity to avoid internal conflict and foreign invasion. Still, this approach had significant unintended consequences. The religious refugees who fled persecution under Mary I and later found themselves marginalized under Elizabeth brought new ideas with them. English Protestants who had taken shelter in Geneva, Strasbourg, and other Reformed centers returned with stronger Calvinist convictions, and often with a more sophisticated understanding of ecclesiastical independence and civic engagement. The exchange of ideas across borders helped sow the seeds of intellectual freedom and individual conscience. Moreover, the presence of both persecuted Catholics and radical Protestants created a social environment in which private religious practice and dissent began to take root. As official enforcement varied by region and over time, many individuals and communities quietly developed their own hybrid religious identities or practiced their faith in secret. This decentralization of belief, while born of repression, encouraged the idea that faith could be personal rather than solely institutional. Over time, these religious pressures contributed to broader questions about the role of the state in personal belief. The experience of persecution under different monarchs made clear that absolute conformity was unworkable and dangerous. The fact that each new ruler could redefine orthodoxy at will demonstrated the instability of a religious system tied too closely to political power. These contradictions did not lead to immediate tolerance, but they made future thinkers more skeptical of the union between church and state. By the early 17th century, especially under the Stuart kings, these Tudor legacies would inform debates about religious liberty. Dissenting sects such as the Baptists and Quakers, who emerged from the Puritan tradition, argued for freedom of worship and the separation of church and state. Many of these groups, frustrated by continued persecution, emigrated to the New World, taking with them both memories of Tudor oppression and aspirations for a new model of religious coexistence. In this way, the Tudor struggles indirectly contributed to the development of religious freedom in England's future colonies. Intellectually, the harsh religious policies of the 16th century left a mark on Enlightenment thinkers. Philosophers such as John Locke, writing in the aftermath of continued religious conflict, would draw upon these historical lessons in advocating for religious tolerance. Locke's A Letter Concerning Toleration argued that coercion in matters of faith was both ineffective and morally wrong, an idea shaped by the failures of Tudor and Stuart religious enforcement. The repression of belief under Mary and Elizabeth served as case studies in the dangers of state religion, helping to crystallize arguments for individual conscience and limited government authority over belief systems. Thus, while the Tudor era was primarily one of religious intolerance, its contradictions and political compromises inadvertently laid the groundwork for more progressive ideals. The use of persecution to enforce orthodoxy revealed the limits of state power in regulating belief, and the emergence of dissenting communities nurtured the concept of religious identity as a personal and protected right. The refugees, reformers, and intellectuals shaped by Tudor policies helped pass these lessons forward into the Age of Enlightenment and eventually into modern democratic frameworks. The religious tumult of the Tudor period offers a rich and sobering reflection on the evolution of tolerance. While neither Mary I nor Elizabeth I embraced religious liberty in a modern sense, their reigns exposed the perils of forced uniformity and the resilience of conscience under pressure. Out of persecution and compromise emerged the early threads of an idea that would later become central to liberal democracy: the right of individuals to believe, speak, and worship according to their convictions, without fear of state retribution. During the Tudor period, the relationship between the English crown and Parliament underwent a subtle but significant transformation that helped lay the foundation for constitutional monarchy. Although the monarchy remained the dominant political power throughout the 16th century, the growing involvement of Parliament in governance, particularly in matters of taxation, lawmaking, and religious reform, began to define an evolving balance of authority that would ultimately challenge the absolutist tendencies of future monarchs. This period did not produce a fully formed constitutional system as understood today, but it undeniably contributed key precedents, legal mechanisms, and ideological shifts that paved the way toward one. At the outset of Tudor rule in 1485, Parliament existed as a formal but largely subordinate institution, summoned and dismissed at the king's will. It was composed of two houses: the Lords, comprising nobles and bishops, and the Commons, made up of representatives from counties and boroughs. Henry VII used Parliament sparingly, preferring to govern through royal prerogative and personal control of revenue. His cautious use of the institution aimed to restore monarchical authority after the Wars of the Roses, ensuring that no new aristocratic factions could gain undue influence through parliamentary channels. Yet even in this restricted capacity, Parliament retained the exclusive right to grant taxes, which proved to be a powerful tool in its long-term assertion of relevance. Henry VIII significantly expanded Parliament's role in both frequency and scope. The Reformation Parliament, which met between 1529 to 1536, marked a pivotal shift. Under Henry's direction, it passed a series of legislative acts that severed England from papal authority and established the king as the supreme head of the Church of England. These acts, including the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Succession, demonstrated that sweeping religious and constitutional changes could be enacted not simply by royal decree but with parliamentary endorsement. While Henry manipulated Parliament to achieve his aims, particularly through the influence of ministers like Thomas Cromwell, the very process of lawmaking in these years gave Parliament a more central role in defining national identity, religious policy, and dynastic legitimacy. This legislative activism helped reinforce the notion that Parliament was not merely a consultative body but a necessary partner in the creation of law. Although the monarch initiated legislation and controlled its passage, the institutional habit of securing Parliament's consent began to shift perceptions about where authority resided. The assertion that even the king needed Parliament's approval to change fundamental aspects of national life hinted at the future limits of royal absolutism. Elizabeth I, despite her political acumen and popularity, also had to contend with a Parliament that was becoming more confident in its privileges. Her reign saw growing tension over matters such as freedom of speech within parliamentary debates, the succession issue, and the regulation of religious conformity. While Elizabeth firmly maintained control, she recognized the utility of calling Parliament to secure funds, particularly for defense against foreign threats like the Spanish Armada. Each time she summoned it for subsidies, however, MPs seized the opportunity to press grievances and assert their concerns. The emergence of a distinct political culture within the House of Commons was critical to this development. Members increasingly viewed themselves not simply as royal functionaries but as representatives of the realm with a duty to scrutinize policy and defend liberties. Debates over the right to free speech within Parliament, notably raised by figures such as Peter Wentworth, reflected a growing sense of institutional independence. Though Elizabeth punished outspoken MPs and guarded her prerogative, she could not fully extinguish these sentiments. The idea that Parliament had certain inviolable rights was taking root, especially in matters of taxation, legislation, and national religion. The Tudor use of statute law also had profound implications. Laws passed by Parliament and ratified by the Crown were seen as binding on both subjects and sovereign alike. This gave parliamentary legislation a unique legitimacy and permanence. It also helped establish the principle that governance should operate within a framework of law rather than purely through monarchical whim. While this legalistic view of monarchy did not yet constrain the sovereign in a modern constitutional sense, it provided the scaffolding for later developments in parliamentary sovereignty and legal accountability. In practical terms, the Tudors utilized Parliament for their own purposes, raising taxes, enforcing religious reforms, legitimizing dynastic claims, but they also unintentionally elevated its stature. The very act of engaging with Parliament to accomplish royal goals gradually normalized the idea that Parliament had a legitimate and necessary role in governance. Over time, this normalization made it more difficult for future monarchs to ignore or override parliamentary authority without conflict. The financial aspect of this dynamic was also essential. Tudor monarchs depended on Parliament for extraordinary revenue, particularly in wartime or during political crises. This dependence gave Parliament leverage. The ability to grant or withhold subsidies became a powerful means of negotiation and influence. Even though monarchs could rely on certain traditional revenues, the increasing costs of administration and foreign policy made parliamentary grants indispensable. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, there was no clear constitutional settlement limiting the Crown's power, but the groundwork had been laid for such a development. Parliament had become a more experienced, organized, and self-aware institution. It had exercised significant influence in shaping the English Reformation, participated in succession debates, and developed procedural norms that emphasized consultation, deliberation, and consent. The recurring summoning of Parliament created an expectation that major national decisions required its involvement, especially those relating to religion, finance, and law. In retrospect, the Tudor era represents a formative stage in the transition from personal monarchy to constitutional monarchy. It was a time when Parliament evolved from a reactive institution into an active participant in governance, albeit still under tight royal control. The legal and institutional precedents set during this period, particularly regarding taxation, legislative authority, and the role of common law, would be invoked repeatedly in the 17th century during the struggles between Parliament and the Stuart kings. The tensions and compromises of Tudor politics thus became the prologue to the constitutional crises of the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, where the idea of a monarchy limited by Parliament would finally be realized. The Tudor period helped reframe the relationship between ruler and ruled, establishing a framework in which royal authority could be challenged, debated, and eventually constrained. Through both intention and accident, the Crown's engagement with Parliament during this time set England on a path toward constitutionalism, rule of law, and the enduring principle that sovereign power must be accountable to the governed. Over the course of the Tudor period, England underwent profound transformations in its urban landscape, social structure, material culture, and manners. Two intertwined shifts shaped public and private life: the rapid urbanization and expansion of cities, especially London, that reshaped social mobility and economic organization, and the increasingly complex fashion and etiquette systems emanating from the royal court that spread across Europe. These changes built a new framework for what we might call early modern society, affecting how people lived, interacted, and identified themselves. At the beginning of Tudor rule under Henry VII, London was a modest medieval city of around 50,000 inhabitants. By 1603, under Elizabeth I, its population had surged to roughly 200,000, making it Europe's largest English-speaking metropolis by far. This phenomenal growth reflected a broader trend across the realm. New industries, trade networks, and governance systems drew people from the countryside into towns and port cities. Norfolk's Norwich, the West Country's Bristol, and the Midlands' Coventry all experienced similar, though smaller, expansions. Physical boundaries shifted outward as medieval walls became obsolete and suburbs developed. Driving this growth was both push and pull. Enclosures, where lords converted arable land into profitable sheep pastures, displaced many small farmers, forcing them into towns. Simultaneously, expanding markets and trade created demand for labor in crafts, manufacturing, ports, and services. This urban influx created a mixed blessing: economic opportunity accompanied by overcrowding, rising prices, and poverty. Around a third of urban residents lived below subsistence, stirring anxiety over vagrancy and begging. As cities grew, so did social fluidity. In medieval society, hierarchy was relatively rigid: nobility, clergy, peasants. By contrast, Tudor urban life allowed ambitious merchants, artisans, and professionals to ascend in wealth and status. Wool merchants, drapers, goldsmiths, brewers, lawyers, physicians. These new elites often married into gentry lines or purchased rural land. This process redefined the class system. The powerful gentry now included both landed families and wealthy non-noble professionals. Civic structures, such as aldermen and guild councils, formalized this shift, placing urban mercantile interests alongside noble influence in local governance. Yet mobility had limits. Social norms and institutional mechanisms like sumptuary laws were erected to prevent upstarts from appearing above their social class. This maintained a visible hierarchy while tolerating some social exchange. Still, economic success could translate into political power. Wealthy merchants influenced town charters and enforced local order. The Tudor city was both chaotic and modernizing. Narrow lanes, market squares and watercourses, some medieval remnants, existed alongside newly regulated commercial districts, wharves and administrative buildings. London's corporation managed roads, sanitation and the expanding fabric trade, while guilds standardized quality, controlled apprenticeships and limited male or female labor entry into professions. Over time, pockets of planned development emerged, like merchant houses and craft workshops. The shift to market economies took several forms. Medieval manorial economies gave way to more fluid trade. Cloth, grain, imported products and foodstuffs circulated regularly between urban and rural areas. Financial devices like credit, bills of exchange and partnerships underpinned the expansion. Urban markets became hubs of consumer exchange rather than local subsistence. Meanwhile, the Tudor court, especially under Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, served as a powerful cultural magnet. As royalty finalized cultural tastes, court fashion became a political language. The adoption of Spanish farthingales by Catherine of Aragon and later drum farthingales under Elizabeth demonstrated how court styles influenced status and identity. Spanish-style bodices, French hoods popularized by and Bullen, and lavish fabrics were adopted by lesser nobility and then aspired to by the upwardly mobile urban classes. Men's fashion reflected class power too. The padded doublet or peascod silhouette, slash sleeves revealing contrasting fabric, ornate ruffs, and codpieces communicated masculinity and wealth. Luxury textiles, silk, velvet, ermine, gold thread, were regulated by sumptuary laws to ensure each status stratum maintained distinct decorum. Clothing signaled gender, class, and virtue. Women wore linen shifts under corsets, constructed by multiple layers, including kirtles, farthingales, and elaborate gowns. Embroidery, lace, and jewels were not frivolous but symbolic. Pearls evoked virginity and purity. Portraits show Elizabeth I in pearls and white gowns, reiterating her identity as chaste sovereign. Court fashion and standards of self-fashioning, promoted by Renaissance ideals, dictated a person's public identity. Dressing well became synonymous with virtue and order. Noble women were expected to appear modest yet elegant, informed by court ideals and religious influences. Men's attire emphasized authority and calm assurance. Masculinity expressed not just through strength but cultured presentation. The court's influence extended beyond aesthetics to manners, conduct, and behavior. Nobles and courtiers were expected to practice courtesy per Castiglione's Book of the Courtier, which stressed speech, poise, and deportment as hallmarks of nobility. In practice, court etiquette set standards for regional elites, who adopted these manners to signal refinement and loyalty. Formal visits to the Queen's court or inclusion in court progresses could elevate or define family status. With trade cities growing wealthy, merchants and craftsmen sought similar codes, sponsoring public festivals and enacting civic pageantry. These mirrored court displays and celebrated city identity, reinforcing civic pride and local hierarchy, an echo of court influence mixing with urban ambitions. The Tudor court's fashion influence resonated across Europe. Sumptuary laws were common in seeking to define class distinctions in dress. Farthingales, ruffs, and court etiquette traveled from London to Paris, Madrid, and Florence. Portraits of nobles from the Netherlands or Germany often feature English-style hoods, ruffs, and fabrics, indicating shared cultural codes at aristocratic levels. English court manners, stylish, controlled, expansive, contributed to pan-European court cultures that prioritized display, symbolism, hierarchical order, and cultural diplomacy. An elaborate presence signaled power, alliance, and decorum long after the Tudor dynasty ended. The twin transformations of urban expansion and courtly culture during the Tudor age cemented frameworks still visible today. London, ceaselessly growing, became the preeminent commercial, governmental, and cultural capital, a model of modern city life. Class mobility, powered by commerce and education, created new elites whose power was tied to property, capital, or service, and not just birth. Clothing, manners, and self-presentation became political tools and communicative devices. Appearance legitimized authority, and distinction signaled belonging. Across England and Europe, dress codes served as a political language, a visual affirmation of hierarchy, loyalty, and identity. Ultimately, the Tudor blend of urban growth, economic reordering, and culture-led elite standards laid the foundations of early modern society. Cities became centers of trade, innovation, and social mobility. Fashion and etiquette reflected and reinforced power. Together, these dynamics shaped not only Tudor England but the developmental trajectory of Western civilization, ushering in modern urban living, symbolic politics, and performance as sources of identity and authority. The rapid pace of urbanization created social mobility and economic transformation, while court-driven fashion and etiquette provided a cultural matrix in which identity, rank, and belonging were constructed. The resulting social systems, urban governance, market economies, symbolic social codes, remain central to our understanding of modernity, bridging medieval structures and emerging modern states. Over the Tudor period, both the realms of expression and diplomacy were arenas of intense control, adaptation, and boundary pushing, setting precedents that resonate in today's political and legal landscapes. From early in Henry VIII's reign, censorship became an essential tool of governance. Books, pamphlets, sermons, plays, anything published or performed, required prior approval from entities like the Privy Council, bishops, the Stationers' Company, and especially the Office of the Revels. This system targeted works deemed heretical, seditious, or scandalous. Licensing was largely a formality for most safe works, but any piece crossing political or moral lines could be suppressed, altered, or destroyed. Plays were overseen by the Master of the Revels, whose power peaked during Elizabeth's later years. All public and private performances required his approval. He held sweeping authority to suppress offending scripts and punish creators, even imprisoning or maiming playwrights, for subversive or threatening content. The Office of the Revels became the precursor of modern theatrical censorship, maintaining control until 1968. Despite the tight controls, an underground literary ecosystem thrived. Pamphlets smuggled from the continent, clandestine presses moving between safe houses, and clandestine works by Puritans or political critics bypassed official routes. These so-called pamphlet wars, and works like Leicester's Commonwealth exposed rifts between state desires for conformity and individual impulses for dissent. They sowed the early ideological seeds of resistance to official narratives. These Tudor-era practices raise critical questions that still animate modern free speech debates. Even then, authors and some government voices questioned whether censorship suppressed truth, fostered falsehood, or insulted public intelligence. Many believed censorship was justified to protect order and morality. Others saw it as an impediment to honest expression and debate. These discussions prefigure Enlightenment defenses of liberty, showing that 16th-century England was already wrestling with balancing authority and expression. On the diplomatic front, the Tudors navigated an unstable international world with shifting alliances and ideology. Henry VIII, under Cardinal Wolsey, sought a new diplomatic path. The Treaty of London in 1518 codified a broad non-aggression pact among European powers, England, France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, Burgundy, and the Papacy, signifying early attempts at collective security and diplomatic balancing. Elizabeth I continued this realpolitik approach, aligning with whichever power could help safeguard her realm. Her caution with Spain and France reflected a nuanced awareness of England's limited resources and political divisions. She alternately courted Catholic monarchs, supported Protestant rebels, and formed secret intelligence networks, keeping opponents off balance while avoiding direct continental entanglement. This pragmatic diplomacy crystallized into an English foreign relations strategy characterized by flexibility, covert action, and support for proxy allies. While not yet an empire, England used diplomacy to punch far above its weight, securing alliances and leveraging conflicts to expand trade and influence without overextension. Tudor diplomacy, in substance and style, laid early foundations for what later became Britain's global presence. Their pattern of balancing great powers, using naval strength to project influence, and expanding through state-chartered activities can be seen in the empire they would later build. The Tudor era redefined the boundaries of control, both within England's written and performed word and in its interactions with foreign nations. The censorship strategies and their underlying justifications still echo in contemporary debates over media regulation and free speech. The flexible, strategic diplomacy of Elizabeth's court foreshadowed Britain's rise as a maritime empire and the modern practice of geopolitical balancing. The Tudors, then, were early architects of political systems that continue to influence how governments negotiate truth and power, both at home and abroad. The Tudors continue to captivate modern audiences with a blend of sex, power, drama, and pageantry that often blurs the lines between myth and historical reality. Contemporary books, films, and television series, from Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall trilogy to hit shows like The Tudors, The White Queen, and the musical Six, reimagine Tudor figures with fresh psychological depth and political relevance. These modern portrayals often emphasize themes like gender agency, religious intrigue, and courtly ambition, as seen in Philippa Gregory's novels and their screen adaptations. Mantel in particular has challenged the long-prevailing Victorian straitjacket that sanitized or romanticized Tudor history, instead presenting Thomas Cromwell and other figures as complex, firmly rooted in their realpolitik contexts. At the same time, pop culture continues to feed the mythologized versions of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, embroidered with opulent gowns, intoxicating romance, backstabbing intrigue, and brutal justice. These characters often straddle the line between icon and caricature. Henry is portrayed alternately as a glamorous monarch or a monstrous tyrant, Elizabeth as a spiritual queen or ruthless queen regnant. Such dualities persist in interviews and narratives around new adaptations, whether stressing modern diversity in castings or highlighting courtly aesthetics. This romanticization can obscure historical nuance. Victorian and early 20th century works often painted Tudor court life in pastel hues, while many modern portrayals still prioritize melodrama over the grittier realities of political and religious repression. Yet more nuanced works, such as Mantel's trilogy, A Man for All Seasons, and even comedic takes like Blackadder 2, provide sharper, more balanced perspectives, probing the ethics of power, conscience, and loyalty. Cultural memory thus becomes a puzzle of romanticized spectacle and more sober reinterpretation. On one side, mass media thrives on glamour, scandal, and emotional pull. On the other, serious historians and creators use counter-narratives to challenge simplistic portrayals and reveal Elizabethan Britain's ideological complexity. Academic analysis emphasizes how historical dramas like Elizabeth R and state pageants used theatrical staging and Republican dialogue to frame royal power, and how modern shows reclaim those theatrical elements to appeal to contemporary senses of authenticity and identity. Social media and fringe voices also shape Tudor mythology. Fan communities, memes, podcasts, museums, and Instagram influencers continually reinvent Tudor figures to fit modern concerns, like feminism, diversity, or medical exploration. Elizabeth I also served as a model of monarchic comportment, unwavering yet measured, symbolic yet pragmatic, nurturing loyalty while maintaining distance. Her skillful use of image, portraits, poetic speeches, state visits, laid groundwork for the modern monarch's role as a national symbol rather than an active political agent. The concept of a constitutional monarch, above politics, respected but not ruling, embodied her balance of authority and restraint. The Tudor dynasty also shaped institutional elements still intact today. The Privy Council, royal progresses, royal household, legal protocols, and court offices were professionalized under Tudor rule. The structures of royal finances, courtly titles, and public accountability that evolved in that era remain reference points for the monarchy's present-day form. This continuity of roles and rituals lends the modern royal family both an aura of tradition and a platform for public engagement. Public appearances, speeches, symbolic clothing choices, and ceremonial visits echo Tudor strategies of visibility, closeness, and structured power. From glorified pageantry on screen to historically informed scholarship, the 75-year Tudor echo still shapes the way we understand monarchy, gender, power, and identity. Whether through binge-watch drama, prismatic feminist voices, or royal weekend coverage, the Tudor dynasty remains a living narrative, at once mythic and institutional, probing our past and guiding our present. The legacy of the Tudors continues to reverberate across the cultural, political, legal, and institutional landscapes of modern Britain and, by extension, much of the Western world. Although their reign spanned little more than a century, the Tudors initiated transformations whose effects have endured for centuries. Their impact can be seen in the continued structure of constitutional monarchy, the foundations of the modern state bureaucracy, the codification of national identity, and the shaping of cultural memory through image, performance, and language. What began as a dynasty consolidating power after civil war ended up scripting the foundations of modern governance and culture. At the core of their lasting influence is the centralization of royal authority and the political reorganization achieved by Henry VII and his successors. Following the Wars of the Roses, Henry VII's tight control over the nobility and his fiscal conservatism established a platform for administrative stability. He eliminated many of the independent power bases that had previously allowed aristocratic families to challenge the crown. By suppressing private armies and enforcing royal justice through the use of institutions like the Court of Star Chamber, he redefined the power dynamics between sovereign and subject. This act of consolidation was a critical first step toward a more unified and centralized nation-state, laying the groundwork for modern constitutionalism. Under Henry VIII, these developments accelerated. The break with Rome was not simply a religious schism but a political revolution that recalibrated sovereignty and authority. The Act of Supremacy declared the monarch the supreme head of the Church of England, embedding royal supremacy into the heart of both spiritual and civic life. This unprecedented fusion of religious and political power forever altered the concept of governance in England. The long-term consequence was the gradual secularization of political authority and the eventual division of church and state, a concept now fundamental in liberal democracies. The English Reformation also triggered profound cultural and social shifts, many of which continue to shape contemporary debates around religious freedom, pluralism, and identity. The Tudor response to Catholicism, ranging from persecution under Mary I to the more pragmatic middle way under Elizabeth I, set enduring patterns for religious tolerance and policy. Though often uneven or punitive during their time, these responses laid the groundwork for Enlightenment-era thinking about conscience, belief, and the limits of state control over faith. The Tudor monarchs also professionalized governance through the expansion of bureaucracy. The growth of a salaried, literate administrative class, civil servants in all but name, created an early version of the modern state apparatus. This shift was not just about efficiency, it was about replacing rule by personal favor and lineage with rule by law and administrative procedure. Many of the institutions responsible for managing modern Britain's infrastructure, justice, and foreign affairs had their early iterations during the Tudor period. Education also flourished, particularly under the patronage of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. Grammar schools multiplied, university curricula modernized, and the influence of Renaissance humanism produced a class of educated citizens capable of critical thought, moral reasoning, and public service. These intellectual traditions became central to the development of liberal education, democratic participation, and civil society. The reverence for classical learning, combined with English-language literary output from figures like Shakespeare and Spenser, helped shape a national culture grounded in language, performance, and shared values. Elizabeth I's reign brought further refinements to national identity and public representation. Her cultivation of the Virgin Queen image was more than symbolic. It was a strategic masterclass in using gender, symbolism, and pageantry to consolidate political authority. She personified the emerging idea of the sovereign as a figurehead rather than an autocrat. Her court became a theater of power, where ceremony, rhetoric, and visual representation served to communicate stability, unity, and strength. In this way, she laid the template for modern monarchy as a cultural institution, rather than a ruling entity, a model that persists in today's British royal family. The Tudors also presided over the earliest phases of what would become the British Empire. Naval innovations and maritime exploration led by figures like John Cabot, Francis Drake, and Walter Raleigh expanded England's reach and economic ambition. The cultural and strategic implications of these voyages were immense. They launched England into global competition for trade and colonization, creating patterns of imperial expansion and commercial exploitation that would later dominate world history. These ventures also shaped attitudes toward exploration, national pride, and the justification of empire, issues that remain subjects of heated debate today. Culturally, the Tudors left behind an indelible legacy in the arts, from architecture to music to literature. The artistic patronage of the Tudor court helped to define the English Renaissance. This was an age that produced a self-aware national literature, a burgeoning theatrical tradition, and a linguistic confidence that would make English a world language. The elevation of the English tongue through scripture, poetry, and drama owes much to this era's blend of nationalism and humanism. The personality-driven nature of the dynasty is another reason why the Tudors remain so embedded in the public imagination. Henry VIII's marital drama and Boleyn's tragic arc, Elizabeth's virgin mystique, these are stories that have transcended the confines of history to become cultural archetypes. They offer narratives of ambition, betrayal, courage, and transformation that continue to be reinterpreted in literature, film, television, and popular media. Each generation projects its own concerns onto these figures, which is why their stories remain vital and contested. They offer more than history, they offer a mirror to contemporary anxieties about power, gender, identity, and authority. The fascination with Tudor personalities also speaks to the human scale of their legacy. While they altered institutions and geopolitics, they also left behind diaries, letters, portraits, and performances that reveal emotional complexity and psychological nuance. This intimacy, combined with the high stakes of their decisions, makes their lives endlessly compelling and tragically resonant. Looking at the monarchy today, one can trace a direct institutional line from the Tudor age. From ritualized state openings of parliament to coronations filled with symbolism, modern monarchy owes its form to Elizabethan innovations in spectacle and meaning. The monarchy's symbolic value, its diplomatic utility, and its role as custodian of national continuity, all these derive from precedents the Tudors helped establish. Even contemporary royal figures such as Elizabeth II or the Prince and Princess of Wales often evoke Tudor tropes: duty, restraint, spectacle, and the art of strategic silence. The global influence of Tudor legacies is no less significant. From the spread of the English language and legal systems to the concept of nationhood and individual conscience, Tudor-era developments helped define core elements of what would become global modernity. They influenced colonial practices, legal codes, literary canons, and religious policies across continents. The Tudors left behind a multifaceted legacy that extends far beyond the intrigue of their courts or the opulence of their ceremonies. They were architects of the modern British state, catalysts of religious transformation, pioneers in education and governance, and enduring icons of cultural memory. Their century of rule reshaped what it meant to be a nation, to wield power, to govern, to believe, and to remember. The fascination they inspire is not mere nostalgia. It is recognition of the foundational role they played in crafting the modern world.